By evening, Arkin Prison was enveloped in an oppressive atmosphere, the air thick with tension and the electric charge of the storm. Charles and his group were in the yard when the heavens broke open. Rain lashed down in hard, punishing sheets, and the wind howled like the cries of the damned. It was chaos, a cacophony of nature's wrath that matched the turbulence inside Charles's heart. Now he yelled over the roar of the storm, and they moved as one towards the weak fence at the far side of the yard, obscured by the heavy rain and darkness. They had observed that during severe weather, the guards took shelter, monitoring the inmates from the relative dryness of their posts. Exploiting this lapse in direct supervision, Charles and his allies cut through the fence, using tools they had smuggled out of the workshop. Every second was fraught with peril, every snip of the wire a deafening shout in the silence of their tense escape. Once through the fence, they crawled on the mud-slick ground, keeping low to avoid the spotlights that swept the yard intermittently. They reached the outer wall, and with the aid of a makeshift rope fashioned from stolen laundry linens, began their perilous climb. The wall, slick with rain, was treacherous, and every slip of the hand, every missed foothold was a brush with death. But desperation lent them strength, and one by one they scaled the wall, dropping to the other side into the unkempt brush that bordered Arkin. They were free, but freedom was just the beginning of another battle. They needed to survive long enough to tell their story. The group split up as planned, agreeing to meet at a safe house provided by a sympathetic guard who Charles had managed to turn to their cause. The guard, disillusioned by the horrors he'd witnessed under Culling's regime, had decided that aiding the inmates was the only way to Mainz. Charles, soaked to the bone and shivering, navigated through the storm, using his memory of the surrounding area, which he had studied from old, discarded maps in the library. Each step took him further from hell and closer to the hope of revelation. Upon reaching the safe house, a dilapidated shack in the woods, several miles from Arkin, Charles found most of his group already there, nursing injuries and the early signs of hypothermia, but alive and free. They waited in silence for the last of their number to arrive, each minute stretching into an eternity. When they were finally reunited, Charles laid out the comics on the rickety table, their pages damp but still legible. "These tell everything. We get these to the right people, and Arkin's horrors will be exposed." The next steps were fraught with risks. They contacted the local media, leveraging connections one of the inmates had on the outside. A clandestine meeting was arranged, and the comics were handed over to a journalist who specialized in uncovering corruption and abuse. As the story broke, the impact was immediate and explosive. The public was outraged, the media fervent in their coverage, and authorities were forced to act. Investigations were launched, and within weeks Arkin was under siege from legal and governmental bodies. Warden Culling was arrested, his reign of terror brought to an abrupt end. The governor faced impeachment, and sweeping reforms were introduced in the penal system. For Charles and his companions, it was a bitter victory. They had suffered unimaginably, yet their actions had ignited change. In the aftermath, Charles dedicated his life to advocating for prison reform and human rights. He spoke at conferences, participated in panels, and worked with non-profit organizations to ensure that the darkness of Arkin would never be repeated in any corner of the world. Arkin itself was shut down, later becoming a research facility dedicated to studying the effects of institutional abuse and reform strategies, a beacon of learning and hope from the ashes of despair. And as for Charles, his journey from inmate to advocate was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are sparks that, when kindled, can burn down the shadows to usher in the light. As the days inched closer to the storm season, Charles and his small band of allies prepared for their escape. They knew that such a plan could only be attempted during a significant event when the guards' attention would be divided. The impending storm promised to be just that. The more he planned, the more Charles felt the weight of their grim reality pressing down upon him, but also the faint, flickering flame of hope. The day of the storm arrived with dark clouds rolling in from the east, a heavy blanket that threatened to smother the earth beneath torrents of rain. By evening, Arkin Prison was enveloped in an oppressive atmosphere, the air thick with tension and the electric charge of the storm. Charles and his group were in the yard when the heavens broke open. Rain lashed down in hard, punishing sheets, and the wind howled like the cries of the damned. It was chaos, a cacophony of nature's wrath that matched the turbulence inside Charles's heart. Now he yelled over the roar of the storm, and they moved as one towards the weak fence at the far side of the yard, obscured by the heavy rain and darkness. They had observed that during severe weather, the guards took shelter, monitoring the inmates from the relative dryness of their posts. Exploiting this lapse in direct supervision, Charles and his allies cut through the fence, using tools they had smuggled out of the workshop. Every second was fraught with peril, every snip of the wire a deafening shout in the silence of their tense escape. Once through the fence, they crawled on the mud-slick ground, keeping low to avoid the spotlights that swept the yard intermittently. They reached the outer wall, and with the aid of a makeshift rope fashioned from stolen laundry linens, began their perilous climb. The wall, slick with rain, was treacherous, and every slip of the hand, every missed foothold was a brush with death. But desperation lent them strength, and one by one they scaled the wall, dropping to the other side into the unkempt brush that bordered Arkin. They were free, but freedom was just the beginning of another battle. They needed to survive long enough to tell their story. The group split up as planned, agreeing to meet at a safe house provided by a sympathetic guard who Charles had managed to turn to their cause. The guard, disillusioned by the horrors he'd witnessed under Culling's regime, had decided that aiding the inmates was the only way to make amends. Charles, soaked to the bone and shivering, navigated through the storm, using his memory of the surrounding area, which he had studied from old, discarded maps in the library. Each step took him further from hell and closer to the hope of revelation. Upon reaching the safe house, a dilapidated shack in the woods several miles from Arkin, Charles found most of his group already there, nursing injuries and the early signs of hypothermia, but alive and free. They waited in silence for the last of their number to arrive, each minute stretching into an eternity. When they were finally reunited, Charles laid out the comics on the rickety table, their pages damp but still legible. "These tell everything. We get these to the right people, and Arkin's horrors will be exposed." The next steps were fraught with risks. They contacted the local media, leveraging connections one of the inmates had on the outside. A clandestine meeting was arranged, and the comics were handed over to a journalist who specialized in uncovering corruption and abuse. As the story broke, the impact was immediate and explosive. The public was outraged, the media fervent in their coverage, and authorities were forced to act. Investigations were launched, and within weeks, Arkin was under siege from legal and governmental bodies. Warden Culling was arrested, his reign of terror brought to an abrupt end. The governor faced impeachment, and sweeping reforms were introduced in the penal system. For Charles and his companions, it was a bitter victory. They had suffered unimaginably, yet their actions had ignited change. In the aftermath, Charles dedicated his life to advocating for prison reform and human rights. He spoke at conferences, participated in panels, and worked with non-profit organizations to ensure that the darkness of Arkin would never be repeated in any corner of the world. Arkin itself was shut down, later becoming a research facility dedicated to studying the effects of institutional abuse and reform strategies, a beacon of learning and hope from the ashes of despair. And as for Charles, his journey from inmate to advocate was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are sparks that, when kindled, can burn down the shadows to usher in the light. As the years passed, Charles's efforts bore fruit in forms he had never imagined. His story and the revelations about Arkin resonated worldwide, igniting a global conversation about the essence of justice and rehabilitation in the penal system. His life, once confined to the despair of prison walls, had become a symbol of hope and relentless pursuit of truth. Yet the fight was far from over. The network that had supported Culling was extensive, its roots deep within the fabric of political and corporate structures. As reforms swept through the prison systems, those resistant to change plotted in the shadows, seeking ways to undermine the progress that had been made. Charles, ever vigilant, found himself at the center of this ongoing battle. With each speech and every public appearance, he was not just advocating for change, he was challenging powerful entities entrenched in the old ways of corruption and exploitation. His life was a testament to the possibility of redemption and the power of resilience, but it also made him a target. One chilly autumn evening, as Charles prepared for a keynote speech at a major human rights conference, he received a call that would once again alter the course of his life. The caller, a whistleblower from within one of the largest private security firms in the country, confirmed his worst fears. Plans were underway to dismantle the reforms and reinstitute practices like those once prevalent at Arkin. Armed with this new information, Charles stepped onto the stage not just to speak but to expose another looming threat. The room was packed, the air thick with anticipation. His voice, once uncertain and timid during his early days of advocacy, now resonated with authority and urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his words cutting through the murmur of conversations, "tonight, I stand before you not just to talk about the progress we've made, but to warn you about the forces that seek to undo it. As we sit here in the comfort of this hall, plans are being set in motion to roll back our hard-won reforms, to reintroduce practices that we fought so hard to eliminate." The crowd listened, rapt, as Charles outlined the details provided by the whistleblower. He spoke not only of the plans but also of the broader implications for society if such regressions were allowed to happen. By the time he concluded, the room was electrified, a mix of outrage and resolve hanging in the air. "This is not just a call to action," Charles declared, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "This is a call to arms, a call to stand and fight against the return of darkness. We've seen what happens when the corrupt are given free rein over the lives of the helpless. We cannot allow history to repeat itself." His speech sparked a new wave of activism, reinvigorating old allies and galvanizing new ones. The media erupted with coverage, and public officials were pressed for responses. Charles's relentless pursuit of justice had once again shifted the narrative, steering it towards light and away from the lurking shadows of greed and cruelty. Months later, as tangible changes began to take shape, Charles stood outside the old site of Arkin Prison, now a centre for study and reform. The cold metal of the plaque commemorating the victims of the prison's dark past was stark under his fingers. Reflecting on the journey, Charles felt the weight of each life that had been lost and each one that had been saved. He realised then that his fight might never be over, that his role as a guardian of justice was a lifetime appointment. But as he looked into the eyes of the young advocates gathered around him, he knew the fight would not be his alone. The spark he had ignited would carry on through generations, a beacon against the darkness, as enduring as the legacy of the man who dared to defy it. And so, under the vast, expansive sky, Charles felt a rare moment of peace, knowing that while the fight was hard and the road was long, every step was a step towards a brighter, more just world. His story, etched in the annals of those who had fought and fallen, would live on, a reminder that even from the deepest darkness, the human spirit could rise, ever resilient, ever defiant.
Restless Nights of Leopold Crane by Thomas Miller. Leopold Crane lay in his bed, staring up at the ceiling as his body was racked with pain. It had been a long day, filled with treatments and doctor's visits. But it was finally over. He closed his eyes and prayed for sleep to come, for even a few hours of respite from the agony that consumed his body. But sleep never came. Instead, he was left to lie there alone with his thoughts. And those thoughts were bleak and filled with despair. Leopold was a terminal man. He had been diagnosed with a rare and deadly form of cancer, and the doctors had given him only a few months to live. Ever since that diagnosis, his world had been turned upside down. He had lost his job, his friends, and even his home. The only thing that remained was his beloved dog, Smitty, who was now his constant companion. But even Smitty couldn't ease the pain that Leopold felt every day. He begged for death every night, but it never came. He wasn't suicidal, but he knew that this world was not meant for him anymore. He had stopped caring about everything and just waited for the end to come. As he lay there, he thought about the life he used to have. He had been a successful businessman with a loving wife and 2 children. But all of that was gone now, and Leopold couldn't help but wonder why he was still here. He had nothing left to live for, and yet death continued to elude him. He reached over to the nightstand and picked up a notebook and a pen. Writing had become his only escape, his only way to make sense of the world around him. He began to write, pouring out his emotions onto the pages in front of him. As he wrote, he thought about his cat, Mr. Bojangles. He had been with Leopold for over 10 years, and they had been inseparable. But a few weeks ago, Mr. Bojangles had passed away, peacefully in Leopold's arms. It was one of the few moments in recent times when Leopold had felt some semblance of peace, but that peace was short-lived, and now Leopold was left with only memories and a deep sense of loss. He closed his eyes and pictured the night that Mr. Bojangles had died. The rain had been pouring down, and Leopold had been sitting on his front porch, holding his beloved cat in his arms. They had watched the rain together, and Leopold had whispered words of love and comfort to his dying friend. Leopold's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He sighed and made his way to the front of the small apartment. He opened the door to find his neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, standing on the other side. "Leopold, dear, are you all right?" she asked, concern etched on her face. "I'm fine, Mrs. Jenkins. Just couldn't sleep." Leopold replied with a forced smile. "You should try to get some rest. You know how important it is to take care of yourself," Mrs. Jenkins scolded gently. She had taken it upon herself to be Leopold's unofficial caretaker, checking on him every day and making sure he was eating and taking his medicine. "I know, Mrs. Jenkins." "Thank you," Leopold replied, trying to hide the pain in his voice. Mrs. Jenkins gave him a sympathetic smile and patted his arm before leaving. Leopold closed the door and made his way back to his bedroom. He lay down on the bed and stared at the ceiling once again. The rain was still pouring down outside, and the sound of it was soothing in a way. He closed his eyes and drifted off into a restless sleep. He dreamed of his wife Anne and how she used to hold him close on nights like this. He could almost feel her arms around him, her voice whispering words of love and comfort in his ear. But when he woke up, she was gone, and he was left alone once again. He couldn't keep living in the past, holding on to memories that were slowly fading away. He had to find a way to live in the present, even if it meant facing the reality of his illness every day. He got up and made his way to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face to help clear his thoughts. He looked in the mirror and saw a tired and broken man staring back at him. The lines on his face seemed deeper, and his eyes were sunken from lack of sleep. He wondered how much longer his body could hold on, how much longer he would have to endure this pain and suffering. But then he thought of Smitty, waiting for him in the other room, and he knew that he had to keep fighting. He had to keep going for his faithful companion, who had never left his side since the day he was diagnosed. He made his way back to the bedroom and sat down at his desk. He opened his notebook and began writing again, pouring out his heart and soul onto the pages. He wrote about his fears and his hopes, his pain and his love. He wrote until his hand ached, and then he wrote some more. As he wrote, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. It was fleeting, but it was there. He looked down at the words he had written and felt a sense of accomplishment. He had poured his heart out onto those pages, and it was a cathartic experience. He closed his notebook and went to check on Smitty. His faithful dog was sleeping soundly in his bed, and Leopold smiled. He lay down next to him and closed his eyes, hoping that sleep would come this time. But as always, it eluded him. He was left to lie there alone with his thoughts once again. And those thoughts were dark and desperate. He thought about his future, about the uncertainty that lay ahead. Would he be able to make it through another day? Would he be able to survive the pain and suffering that seemed to never end? He thought about his wife and children and how much he missed them. He wished he could turn back time and make things right. But it was too late for that now. He thought about death and how it seemed to mock him every night. He begged for it to come and take him away from this world, but it never did. He thought about the world outside, the world that he used to be a part of. It seemed so foreign to him now, and he didn't know if he would ever be able to find his place in it again. As the night wore on, Leopold's thoughts became more and more desperate. He cried out for death, for an end to his suffering, but it never came. And so, as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the curtains, Leopold finally gave in to exhaustion and fell into a fitful sleep. He dreamed of a world without pain, without suffering, without death. He dreamed of a world where he could be reunited with his beloved wife and children. But as the sun rose higher in the sky, reality came crashing back down on him. He opened his eyes and was greeted by the harsh light of day. He got up, feeling more exhausted than when he had gone to bed, and made his way to the kitchen. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, staring out the window at the world outside. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. He picked it up and heard Mrs. Jenkins' voice on the other end. "Leopold, dear, I'm going to the grocery store. Do you need anything?" she asked kindly. "No, thank you, Mrs. Jenkins." "I'm fine," Leopold replied. "Well, if you change your mind, you know where to find me," Mrs. Jenkins said before hanging up. Leopold finished his coffee and made his way back to his bedroom. He sat down at his desk and opened his notebook once again. He read over the words he had written the night before, and a sense of peace washed over him once again. He knew that he couldn't keep living in the past, holding on to memories that would never come back. He had to find a way to make the most of the time he had left, to find some sense of purpose in this world that seemed to have no place for him. He picked up his pen and began to write, pouring out his heart onto the pages once again. And as he wrote, a small spark of hope ignited within him. Maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth living for in this world.
The Phantom of Palatka. In the quaint town of Palatka, nestled along the banks of the St. John's River, there was a legend as old as the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks, a legend of the Phantom of Palatka. The story was whispered in hushed tones among the townsfolk, passed down from one generation to the next, each retelling adding a new layer to the mystery. But for the first time in decades, the phantom would become more than a tale, he would become a reality. Chapter 1: The Ghost of the Past. The Phantom, once known as Elias, was a soldier who returned to Palatka during the Civil War, only to find his hometown ravaged and his loved ones gone. Consumed by despair, Elias retreated into the swamps, where he was believed to have perished. Yet his spirit never left, haunting the town as a mere shadow, a reminder of a past filled with pain. For years, Elias was nothing more than a fleeting presence, a cold breeze, a flicker of movement, harmless, but always there, a silent testament to the town's tragic history. Chapter 2: A Glimpse of Light. Leela, a young artist, moved to Palatka, captivated by its beauty. She wasn't afraid of the old tales, instead, they intrigued her. One evening, while sketching along the riverbank, she saw a figure standing on the opposite shore, half hidden in shadows. Rather than flee, Leela felt an inexplicable connection to the figure and began returning to that spot, speaking to him even though he never replied. Over time, the figure, Elias, began to emerge more into the light, drawn by Lila's warmth and openness. Though still shrouded in darkness, something within him stirred, something that had been dormant for so long. Chapter 3: The Blossoming Affection. As the weeks passed, Elias began to step closer to Leela, and she started to sense the depth of his loneliness. She felt an unspoken bond forming between them, though she couldn't fully understand it. One evening, she crossed the river to stand beside him, offering her hand in a gesture of connection. For the first time in decades, Elias felt the warmth of another human being, and with it, a glimmer of hope. Chapter 4: The Rejection. But as Lila's feelings deepened, so too did her fear and confusion. The townspeople noticed her absences and began to warn her of the dangers of consorting with a ghost. One evening, standing beside Elias, Leela realized the vast divide between them. He was bound by the past, while she was full of life. Overwhelmed, she pulled away, whispering, "I can't love a ghost." Elias's fragile hope shattered. The warmth he had felt was ripped away, and he retreated back into the shadows, his heart breaking once more. Chapter 5: The Descent into Darkness. Lila's rejection reopened old wounds within Elias, wounds that had never truly healed. His sorrow turned to rage, and he withdrew into the swamps. The townspeople soon noticed his absence, but instead of peace, they were met with a growing sense of dread. Elias's pain demanded retribution. The peaceful figure who once haunted the town in silence became a harbinger of terror. Animals were found slaughtered, crops withered, and those who ventured too close to the swamps returned with tales of a shadow that followed them. Palatka was gripped by fear, knowing they had angered something beyond their control. Chapter 6: The Phantom's Wrath. The town's fear grew as Elias's vengeance escalated. He became a shadowy figure who appeared on the edges of the town, his presence a constant reminder of the terror he brought. Those who had warned Leela began to suffer. Mysterious accidents, unexplained illnesses, and disappearances became common. Palatka was slowly strangled by the fear of the unknown, of a spirit consumed by darkness. Chapter 7 A Final Plea. Haunted by guilt, Leela knew she had to act. The town was falling apart, and it was her fault. Desperate, she returned to the riverbank, calling out to Elias. He emerged from the shadows, his eyes now filled with cold fury. "You gave me hope," he said, "and then you tore it away." Tears streaming down her face, Leela pleaded for the town, offering her own life in exchange for their safety. Elias hesitated, the rage in his eyes flickering. He knelt beside her, lifting her chin to look into her eyes. "Do you think your life is worth the cost of my torment?" he asked softly. Leela, sobbing, whispered, "Yes, if it will save them." For a moment, Elias seemed to waver, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. But the darkness within him was too deep, too consuming. "It's too late," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I cannot be saved, and neither can they." As Lila's sobs echoed in the night, Elias slowly faded into the shadows, leaving her alone by the riverbank. The town of Palatka, now cursed by the phantom's wrath, would never be the same. Lila's sacrifice had come too late, and the legend of the Phantom of Palatka would live on, a story of love, loss, and the price of despair. Chapter 8 The Aftermath. The town of Palatka, once a peaceful haven by the St. John's River, was now a place of perpetual gloom. The air was thick with sorrow, the people subdued by the weight of what had transpired. Leela, though still living, was a shell of her former self. She walked the streets of Palatka, haunted by her memories and the knowledge that she had failed to save the town or the man who had once been Elias. The strange occurrences that had plagued the town began to taper off, but the damage had been done, the crops never fully recovered, and the once lively riverbank remained eerily quiet, avoided by all but the most reckless. The townsfolk spoke less and less of the phantom, hoping that by ignoring the past, they could somehow move forward. But the shadow of Elias lingered, and Palatka was forever marked by the tragedy that had unfolded. Leela spent her days in solitude, painting the landscapes of her broken heart, dark, melancholic scenes of the swamps, the river, and the figure who haunted her dreams. Her art, once vibrant and full of life, became a reflection of her inner turmoil. The townspeople, who had once marveled at her talent, now regarded her with pity, seeing in her the embodiment of the town's curse. Chapter 9 A Glimmer of Redemption. Years passed, and the story of the Phantom of Palatka faded into legend once more, a tale told only in whispers to frightened children. But Leela, now older and worn by time, could not escape the past. She returned to the riverbank every evening, just as she had when she first encountered Elias, her heart heavy with regret. One autumn night, as the first cold winds began to sweep through the town, Leela stood by the river, her thoughts consumed by memories. She closed her eyes, feeling the familiar chill in the air, when suddenly, she sensed a presence beside her. Her heart raced, and she opened her eyes to find Elias standing there, his figure still shrouded in darkness, but less menacing than before. "I've waited for you," Leela whispered, her voice trembling. "I've waited all these years, hoping you would come back." Elias remained silent, his expression unreadable. But there was something different about him, something softer, less consumed by the rage that had once driven him. Leela reached out a trembling hand, just as she had done all those years ago. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was young and foolish, and I didn't understand. I never meant to hurt you." Elias's hand hovered above hers, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might take it. But then he pulled away, the distance between them too great to bridge. "It's too late for us, Leela," Elias said, his voice filled with a sorrow that echoed through the night. "The past cannot be undone, and the pain we've caused each other is too deep. I am no longer the man I once was, and you are not the girl who first came to this town." Lila's heart broke anew, but she knew he was right. They were both different now, shaped by the choices they had made and the consequences that had followed. The love they had felt, or what might have been love, was lost to time. "I understand," Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I want you to know that I never stopped caring, I never stopped hoping that somehow, you could find peace." Elias looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch across the centuries. "Peace is not something I can have, Lila. Not in this world. But perhaps, knowing that you cared, it's enough to ease the burden I carry." With those words, Elias began to fade, his form becoming more insubstantial with each passing second. Lila watched, tears streaming down her face, as the phantom of Palatka disappeared into the night, leaving her alone once more. Epilogue: the legend lives on. In the years that followed, the town of Palatka slowly began to heal. The land, though scarred, became fertile again, and the people learned to smile, though their eyes still held a trace of the sorrow they had endured. The legend of the phantom became just that, a legend, something told by the fireside on dark nights, a cautionary tale of love, loss, and the dangers of meddling with the unknown. Lila lived out her days quietly, her art reflecting the depth of her soul. She never married, never had children, but she found a measure of peace in her solitude, knowing that she had done what she could to make amends. When she passed away, her paintings, dark and beautiful, were all that remained, a testament to the life she had lived and the man she had loved. The phantom of Palatka was never seen again, but the townspeople still whispered his name on cold, misty nights, believing that he might still be out there, watching, waiting. And perhaps, in some way, he was, forever bound to the town he could never truly leave, and to the woman who had once touched his heart.
Hector Fugo lay in his bed, the sterile white sheets and the soft beeping of the heart monitor the only companions to his final moments. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn to block out the harsh midday sun, casting long shadows on the walls. He gazed at the ceiling, his breath shallow and laboured, each inhale a struggle against the pain that gnawed at his frail body. Hector had always been a solitary man, more comfortable with his thoughts and books than with people. But in his final days, as he lay bedridden, he had hoped for the comfort of familiar faces, the warmth of a hand in his, the sound of voices that cared. He had reached out to those he thought he could count on, old friends, distant family, even neighbours he had helped over the years, but one by one they had found reasons not to come. "Sorry, Hector. I've got work," his childhood friend John had said over the phone, his voice tinged with guilt. "You know how it is, right? I'll try to visit next week." "Hector, you know I would come, but the kids are sick, and I can't leave them," his sister had explained, her words hurried and distant. "Maybe when they get better, okay?" "I wish I could be there, Hector, but you know how things are with me and the wife right now," a neighbour had mumbled, avoiding eye contact when he ran into him at the market weeks before. "I'll make it up to you, I promise." Excuses, justifications, promises of future visits that would never come. Hector had listened to them all, nodding weakly, his heart sinking with each conversation. He understood their reasons, each one valid in its own way, but as he lay dying, the understanding offered little comfort. The days turned into weeks, and Hector's strength waned. The loneliness was a constant ache, deeper than the physical pain. He watched the door, hoping it would open, that someone would walk in and break the silence. But it remained closed, a barrier between him and the world he was slowly leaving behind. On his last day, the room seemed quieter than ever. The beeping of the monitor was slower now, each beep a reminder of the time slipping away. Hector's eyes were heavy, his vision blurry, but he kept them open, straining to see any sign of a visitor. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow through a small gap in the curtains, a sliver of light that danced on the floor. Hector's breath grew more ragged, each one a battle he was losing. He closed his eyes, a tear slipping down his cheek, a silent farewell to the world that had forgotten him. As he took his last breath, there were no whispered apologies, no heartfelt goodbyes. The room remained empty, the only witnesses to his passing the indifferent walls and the unfeeling machines. In the end, Hector Fugo died as he had lived alone, with only his thoughts for company. Outside, life went on. People continued with their work, their families, their lives, each one believing that their reasons, their justifications, were enough. They would remember Hecate later, they told themselves. They would visit his grave, pay their respects, share stories of the man they had known. But for Hecate, there were no second chances, no do-overs. His final moments were a testament to a life that had touched many, but was ultimately unacknowledged in his greatest hour of need. And as the sun set on that quiet room, the world outside remained blissfully unaware of the sorrow and loneliness that had marked the end of Hecate Fugo's journey. Glowing Love of an Eternal Love by Thomas. Her groom Edgar stood at the end of the aisle, his face illuminated with pure adoration. The church was filled with the warm glow of candlelight, and the scent of fresh white roses wafted through the air. Lenore's heart fluttered as she approached Edgar, his smile growing wider with each step she took. She couldn't believe this was finally happening. After months of waiting, they were finally going to be married. It felt like a dream, and she was afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would wake up and find herself back in their small apartment, still waiting for this day to come. But as she reached the altar and took Edgar's hands in hers, she knew that this was real. This was her moment, her happy ending. Nothing could take this away from her. The priest began the ceremony, his words a blur as Lenore gazed into Edgar's eyes. She didn't need to listen to the vows essay, she knew them by heart. She had dreamed of this day for so long, and now it was finally here. As the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Lenore felt tears of joy pricking at her eyes. She leaned in for their first kiss as a married couple, the cheers and claps of their loved ones filling the church. But just as their lips were about to meet, a loud cough echoed through the church, breaking the moment. Lenore opened her eyes to see her sister, Amelia, clutching her chest and struggling to catch her breath. "Are you okay?" Lenore asked, concerned. Amelia shook her head, her face pale. "I don't feel well," she managed to say before collapsing to the ground. Panic swept through the church as guests rushed to Amelia's side. Lenore's mother, a nurse, quickly assessed her and declared that they needed to get Amelia to a hospital immediately. Lenore's heart sank as she watched her sister being carried out of the church. She had been looking forward to having Amelia by her side on her special day, but now she was being taken away by a deadly illness. But Lena couldn't dwell on her sister's illness for long. She was a newlywed now, and it was time to celebrate with her husband. As they made their way to their reception, Lenore tried to push away thoughts of Amelia and focus on the happiness of the... But as the night went on, more and more guests began to fall ill. Some even had to leave the reception early, their faces pale and their bodies weak. Lenore couldn't help but feel guilty. Maybe she shouldn't have had the wedding during a pandemic, but she couldn't have predicted that it would become this severe. And besides, she and Edgar had waited so long to be married. They couldn't wait any longer. As the last guests left and the reception came to an end, Lenore and Edgar retired to their hotel room. As they lay in bed together, Lenore couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. She knew that the Spanish flu was spreading rapidly, and she couldn't help but worry about her loved ones, especially her sister. But Edgar held her close and reassured her that everything would be okay. They were together now. But the next morning, Lenore woke up to find Edgar cold and unresponsive next to her. She shook him, calling his name, but he didn't stir. Panic consumed her as she realized that he was gone. Just like that, her happy ending was taken away from her. Lenore couldn't believe this was happening. She had finally found the love of her life, only to lose him on their wedding night. As she sat next to his lifeless body, tears streaming down her face, she couldn't help but think that this was just her luck. She had never been able to catch a break, and now, during a pandemic, she couldn't even have a happy ending. But she refused to let Edgar's death be in vain. She had to keep going. She made her way back to her family's home, where Amelia was still recovering from the flu. Lenore vowed to take care of her sister and help her get back on her feet. But as the days and weeks went by, the Spanish flu showed no signs of slowing down. It seemed like every day, more and more people were falling ill and dying. Lenore did her best to help in any way she could, but she couldn't help but feel overwhelmed and scared. Amelia's condition was improving, but Lenore knew that she couldn't stay with her forever. She had to find a way to support herself, especially now that she was alone and had no husband to rely on. She managed to find a job at a local factory, sewing masks and gowns for healthcare workers. It was hard work, but she was grateful to have a steady income. But every night, as she lay in bed alone, she couldn't help but think about Edgar. She missed him more than words could express, and she couldn't imagine ever finding love again. But then, one day, a man named William started working at the factory. He was kind and handsome, and Lenore couldn't help but feel drawn to him. They started talking and soon became friends, and eventually, William asked her out on a date. Lenore was hesitant at first. She didn't want to betray Edgar's memory. But William was persistent, and Lenore couldn't deny the feelings she had for him. Their date was magical, and for a brief moment, Lenore felt like she was truly happy again. But as they said their goodbyes, William told her that he had been feeling sick for the past few days. Lenore's heart sank. She couldn't bear to lose someone else to the Spanish flu. But as William leaned in to kiss her, she couldn't resist. A few days later, William's condition worsened and he was taken to the hospital. Lenore feared the worst, but to her surprise, he recovered. She was overjoyed and grateful, and they began dating officially. But even in the midst of their new love, the Spanish flu continued to take its toll. Lenore's mother fell ill and passed away, leaving Lenore and Amelia to grieve yet another loss. But through it all, William stood by Lenore's side, supporting her and helping her in any way he could. And as they sat together, holding hands, she couldn't help but feel like she had found her happy ending once again. But the Spanish flu wasn't finished. It continued to ravage the world, taking more and more lives each day. And as the years went by, Lenore and William faced their own struggles. Financial hardships, the loss of loved ones, and the ever-present fear of the flu. But through it all, they were together. And for Lenore, that was enough. She had found her happy ending, even if it wasn't the one she had always dreamed of. Love, she realized, was the one thing that could survive anything, even the Spanish flu. And as long as she had William by her side, she knew that she would be okay. Influenza forever, she thought with a smile on her face. Despite everything, they had found their forever in each other, and that was all that mattered.
The Town That Once Was, The Fall of Mortionville, by Thomas Miller. Chapter 1, A Picture-Perfect Beginning. Mortionville, Texas. If you had asked anyone from the town what it was like, they'd tell you it was the closest thing to heaven on earth. Tucked away in the southernmost part of the state, Mortionville sat peacefully right on the border with Mexico. It was a place where the sun seemed to shine a little brighter, the air was sweeter, and the people were kinder than anywhere else. Everyone knew each other, from the oldest resident, Ms. McCracken, to the youngest kid in the local elementary school. There were no strangers in Mortionville, just neighbors you hadn't yet met. The town had grown up around its main street, a line of low, weathered buildings housing everything the town needed: a diner, a post office, a general store, a school, and the church. On any given day, you could find people gathered in the diner, sipping on coffee, sharing gossip, and laughing over plates of apple pie. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And, most importantly, it was home. What made Mortionville special wasn't its size or its location, it was its people. This was a town where families had lived for generations, passing down homes and businesses like heirlooms. The spirit of the place was rooted in unity, in the understanding that everyone in Mortionville was responsible for one another. Disagreements were settled over a handshake and a beer, and the town itself felt like one big family reunion that never ended. Though it was small, the town had an undeniable charm. The red, white, and blue flag of the United States fluttered proudly on every porch, a reminder of the shared values that held the community together. Patriotism ran deep in Mawsonville, as did faith and loyalty to one another. You'd be hard-pressed to find a person in the town who hadn't served in the military or whose parents or grandparents hadn't contributed to the community in some way. It was a town that knew the meaning of sacrifice and the importance of standing together. Yet, despite its closeness to the Mexican border, the troubles that plagued larger towns or cities seemed a world away. In fact, for years, Mawsonville had gone untouched by the issues of immigration or border security. While other border towns were wrestling with an influx of people crossing into the United States, Mawsonville remained isolated from the conflict. The U.S. Border Patrol made their occasional rounds, but for the most part, they left Mawsonville alone. The town had a reputation for being safe, tight-knit, and completely self-sufficient. What no one in Mawsonville could have predicted, though, was how that isolation would eventually work against them. As time went on, the U.S. government gradually pulled back its resources from smaller towns like Mawsonville. With more focus on larger cities with higher crossing rates, the Border Patrol became less and less visible. But that didn't matter much to the people of Mawsonville. They believed their quiet corner of Texas would remain untouched. And in a way, it did. Because, in Mawsonville, the border wasn't just a line drawn between two countries. It was the edge of a world that had nothing to do with them. The people who crossed the border, families looking for a better life or travelers passing through, were rarely a threat. The townspeople helped when they could, offering food or water to those in need, but for the most part, they kept to themselves. Mawsonville didn't see outsiders as problems. It saw them as people, just like them. Still, to protect their small slice of paradise, a group of 6 men, all local to the town, took it upon themselves to monitor the borders unofficially. The leader, Tom Wallace, had lived in Mawsonville his entire life. A former Marine, he brought discipline and a sense of duty to the informal group of volunteers. The others, Mike Tanner, the Mitchell brothers, John Morris, and Dan Russo, were all ordinary men with a deep love for their town. They had families to protect, lives they valued. And if no one else was going to keep an eye on things, then they would. After all, it was their town, and it was worth protecting. Their work was never glamorous, nor did it come with any pay. They kept watch on the outskirts of the town, occasionally guiding lost travelers back toward safer paths or warning them away when necessary. In the beginning, it felt like a community service, something they did out of pride and responsibility. It was hardly ever dangerous. In fact, the biggest problems they faced were the scorching summer heat and the wild animals that roamed the desert at night. But over the years, the group grew older. And while their spirit remained strong, their bodies did not. There was no one stepping up to replace them, no younger generation willing to take on the mantle of protecting the town. People didn't think it was necessary. Why bother when the town had always been safe? Why worry when Mawsonville had never seen any real trouble? No one realized how vulnerable they had become. For years, Mawsonville had been the perfect American small town. But perfection, as everyone would soon learn, is often the calm before the storm. And the storm was coming. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting a warm golden light over the town, the people of Mawsonville went about their lives, unaware that their peaceful days were numbered. They didn't yet know that the safety they had always relied on would soon be shattered. What had once been a symbol of unity and protection, their beloved town, would become a battleground. Chapter 2: The Self-Appointed Guardians. The 6 men who took it upon themselves to watch over Mawsonville were the town's unspoken defenders. Tom Wallace was their leader, not because he wanted to be, but because no one else could do the job quite like him. His time as a Marine had shaped him into the perfect mix of discipline and stubbornness, and though his hair had grayed and his knees had started to ache, his resolve had never wavered. Tom wasn't just watching the border, he was watching over his home, his family, and everything he held dear. The others followed his lead, each bringing their own skills to the table. Mike Tanner, despite his age, still had the sharpest eyes in the group. He could spot movement in the distance long before anyone else, though his limp from an old war wound made his patrols slower these days. The Mitchell brothers, Frank and Harry, were the muscle. Burly and tough, they ran the local hardware store and were always the first to show up when something needed fixing or someone needed help.
John Morris, the town schoolteacher, wasn't a fighter by nature, but his sense of duty to his students and their families made him a loyal part of the group. And then there was Dan Russo, the town mechanic, who kept their trucks running and made sure the group had everything they needed to keep Mortionville secure. The 6 men had taken on the responsibility of watching the border years ago, when the government began pulling back on resources. It hadn't been a sudden shift, but a gradual one. Patrols became less frequent, and the federal government's attention drifted to larger towns and cities. No one was going to look out for Mortionville except the people who lived there, and these 6 men decided they would be the ones to do it. At first, it had been almost too easy. The men would meet up at the diner in the morning, sharing a cup of coffee before heading out to patrol the stretches of desert that bordered the town. They weren't law enforcement, and they didn't pretend to be. Their job wasn't to arrest anyone, just to keep an eye on things and make sure the town stayed safe. Most of the people who crossed the border were families, desperate for a better life, and the men did their best to help when they could. Water, food, a point in the right direction, it was the least they could do. But they had rules. No one crossed into Mortionville without their knowledge, and no one stayed long. The town was too small, too fragile, to support an influx of strangers. The men were polite but firm. Mortionville was not a place for outsiders. Over the years, the patrols became more routine, and the 6 men grew comfortable in their role. They knew the land like the back of their hands. Every hill, every wash, every trail. It was their territory, and they believed they had it under control. Yet, as time passed, their numbers began to dwindle, not because of any outside threat, but because of time itself. The men were getting older, slower. Tom Wallacey's knees ached more with every patrol, and Mike Tanner's eyesight wasn't what it used to be. Frank Mitchell had been talking about retirement for years, and his brother Harry had already started spending more time fishing than working. John Morris had taken on extra hours at the school, leaving less time for patrols, and Dan Russo had more business than ever at his garage, with no time for late-night watches in the desert. The younger men of Mortionville showed no interest in taking up the mantle. Why would they? The town was peaceful, and the border patrol still showed up once in a while. It seemed unnecessary to spend your time patrolling the outskirts when nothing ever happened. But complacency is a dangerous thing. One hot afternoon, Tom sat on his porch, gazing out at the wide-open expanse of desert beyond the town. The air shimmered with heat, and a few vultures circled lazily overhead, searching for their next meal. Tom's gut told him something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It was the kind of feeling he used to get before a mission, back when he was stationed overseas. That quiet, gnawing sense of unease that told him trouble was coming, even when everything looked fine on the surface. He wasn't alone in his worry. Mike Tanner had mentioned it to him just the other day. "Something's different," Mike had said, leaning on his cane as they stood in the shade by the diner. "I don't know what it is, but I can feel it in my bones." Tom had nodded, but he hadn't known what to say. What could they do? They were just 6 old men trying to hold on to something they had no control over. The border patrol hadn't been through in weeks, and the number of people crossing seemed to have increased. Not families, this time, men. Groups of them. Some armed. They didn't linger, and they didn't talk, but their presence sent a clear message. Things were changing. "We should tell the sheriff," John Morris had suggested one evening after patrol, his brow furrowed with worry. But Tom had waved him off. The sheriff's got enough on his plate. Besides, what's he going to do? Send out a couple of deputies to patrol with us? It's not like we've got an army here. John had fallen silent after that, but the look of concern never left his face. The others had felt it too. The feeling that something was slipping away from them, that the control they once had over their small piece of the world was eroding. Then one day, Mike Tanner didn't come back from his patrol. The sun was setting by the time Tom realized Mike was late. He should have been back hours ago. Tom gathered the others, John, Dan, the Mitchell brothers, and they set out in their trucks, searching the dusty trails that crisscrossed the desert. They found Mike's truck near the old crossing point, doors wide open, keys still in the ignition. But of Mike himself, there was no sign. The men searched through the night, but it was as if Mike had vanished into thin air. His disappearance sent a ripple of fear through the town. People whispered that maybe he had gotten lost, maybe he had wandered too far in the heat. But Tom and the others knew better. Mike hadn't gotten lost. Something, or someone, had taken him. For the first time in their lives, the men of Mortionville realized that they weren't just playing at being protectors anymore. The threat they had always feared was real. And it had come for one of their own. Tom sat alone on his porch later that night, the weight of Mike's disappearance heavy on his heart. The desert, once so familiar and welcoming, now felt hostile and foreign. The uneasy feeling in his gut had grown into a deep, cold dread. Something was coming for Mortionville. And it wasn't going to stop until it had taken everything. Chapter 3. The Cartel Arrives. The disappearance of Mike Tanner sent shockwaves through Mortionville. In a town where nothing ever happened, something like this was unthinkable. Families locked their doors at night, a habit they hadn't practiced in years. The usual friendly conversations at the diner grew tense, whispers circulating among the townsfolk. Rumors flew, but no one really knew what to believe. Some said Mike had wandered into cartel territory. Others speculated he'd been taken, though by whom no one could say for sure. But everyone agreed on one thing: things were changing in Mortionville. The sense of peace that had always blanketed the town had been shattered, and no one knew how to piece it back together. Tom Wallace and the others didn't give up on finding Mike. They searched every inch of the desert around the town for days, calling in every favor they could from nearby towns and local authorities. But the sheriff's department was stretched thin, and the government's priorities were far from the border town of Mortionville. There was no help coming. As the days passed, the men were forced to accept the reality they didn't want to face: Mike wasn't coming back. What had happened to him was no accident. Someone had taken him, and the cartel was the most likely culprit. The men had heard whispers for years about cartel activity just across the border, but it had never seemed like something they had to worry about. Mortionville had always been too small, too insignificant for anyone to bother with. But that had changed. And soon, the town would learn just how wrong they had been. The first sign that the cartel had its eye on Mortionville came not long after Mike's disappearance. A group of strangers rolled into town one afternoon, their trucks kicking up clouds of dust as they parked along the deserted main street. The men who stepped out weren't like the travelers who had passed through before. These men were hardened, muscular, tattooed, and armed. They wore sunglasses even though the sun had started to sink below the horizon, casting long shadows over the town. Their presence was like a dark cloud, heavy and suffocating. Tom and the remaining guardians watched from the diner, where they had gathered to talk strategy. Tom's instincts told him to act, but they were outnumbered, and there was no backup in sight. He knew better than to rush into a confrontation unprepared, but his gut twisted as he watched the men stroll down the street like they owned the place. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down the side of his face, walked into the diner without so much as a knock. The chatter inside fell to a hush, every eye on the strangers as they entered. Tom stood up slowly, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of his pistol, hidden under the table. He met the leader's gaze, trying to read the man's intentions. "You in charge here?" the man asked, his voice smooth but carrying a dangerous edge. Tom squared his shoulders. "Something like that." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. That'll make this easier." Tom's hand tightened on his pistol, though he didn't draw it. "And what exactly is this?" The man's smile faded. "We're here to let you know that this town, Mortionville, right, is under new management. My boss has plans for this place, and we don't want any trouble. But if you or anyone else tries to get in the way, well," he glanced around the room, his gaze lingering on the other patrons, "it won't end well for you." Tom's jaw clenched. "What plans?" The man shrugged. "Doesn't matter to you. Just know that starting now, this town is ours. And if you want to stay alive, you'll keep your heads down and your mouths shut." The air in the diner seemed to thicken with tension. Tom's mind raced as he considered his options. He could shoot the man right then and there, start a fight he knew he couldn't win. Or he could let the cartel move in, let them take over without a word. But neither option sat right with him. Tom had spent his whole life fighting for the things he believed in. Mortionville was his home, his family's home, and he wasn't about to let some outsider come in and take that away. But he also knew that going up against the cartel without backup was suicide. "We don't want trouble," Tom said finally, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "But this is our town. You don't get to just walk in here and take it." The man chuckled, but it was a cold, humorless sound. "You'll learn soon enough, old man. There's no stopping what's coming. Mortionville's ours now." With that, he turned on his heel and walked out, the rest of his men following him without another word. The door swung shut behind them, and the diner was left in an eerie silence. Tom stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, his mind racing. This was it. The fight they had always feared but never expected had arrived. The cartel wanted Mortionville, and they weren't going to take no for an answer. That night, Tom called the other guardians together at his home. They sat around his worn kitchen table, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on all of them. The Mitchell brothers looked grim, their faces set in hard lines. John Morris stared at the table, his hands clenched into fists, while Dan Russo rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion clear in his eyes. "We can't just let them take over." "Like who?" Frank Mitchell asked. "The sheriff's already stretched thin, and the government doesn't give a damn about us. We're just a dot on the map to them." Tom shook his head. "There's got to be someone. We'll start making calls. Maybe we can get the feds involved, or the state. Someone will listen." But even as he said it, Tom knew how unlikely it was. They were on their own, and deep down, he knew the odds weren't in their favor. Over the next few weeks, the cartel's presence in Mortionville grew. They moved in quietly at first, setting up shop on the outskirts of town, but it wasn't long before they made their intentions clear. Businesses were threatened, people were intimidated, and the once peaceful streets of Mortionville began to feel like a battleground. The 6 men tried to hold the line, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. The cartel was too strong, too well organized, and they had no qualms about using violence to get what they wanted. What the men didn't realize was that the worst was yet to come. The cartel wasn't just after Mortionville. They wanted to turn the town into a hub for their smuggling operations, a safe base where they could funnel drugs, weapons, and people across the border without interference. And the people of Mortionville, the good, honest people who had built their lives in that town, were nothing more than collateral damage. The fight for Mortionville had only just begun. And it wasn't going to end without blood. Chapter 4, A Slow Descent into Chaos. Mortionville wasn't the same town it had been just a few months ago. The once vibrant Main Street, filled with laughter and neighborly chats, had turned into a shadow of its former self. The town's heart, the diner where everyone gathered for coffee and conversation, was now a place of whispered fears and hushed voices. People had started avoiding eye contact, keeping their heads down as they went about their business. The unwritten rule of Mortionville, everyone looks out for each other, was slowly unraveling. The cartel was tightening its grip. At first, it was subtle. A few unfamiliar faces standing around the edges of town, watching. Then, it grew more obvious. Businesses were visited by men with cold eyes and promises that everything would be fine as long as they cooperated. Payments started being demanded, protection money for businesses that had never needed protection before. A small group of outsiders, once viewed with suspicion, now operated openly. And the townsfolk, once proud and fearless, had begun to shrink back into themselves, afraid of what might happen if they didn't. The 6 men who had always stood tall for Mortionville were feeling the pressure too. Tom Wallace hadn't slept in days, bags under his eyes showing the weight of responsibility that had only grown heavier since Mike Tanner's disappearance. He felt the town slipping through his fingers, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the inevitable. He met with the other men regularly, but their options were growing slimmer by the day. "We can't keep doing this," Dan Russo muttered one night as they gathered in Tom's living room. He was pacing back and forth, frustration evident in every step. "We're outnumbered, outgunned, and there's no help coming. I've been trying to get through to someone at the state level, but no one's listening. Mortionville isn't on anyone's radar." John Morris, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, nodded wearily. "The school's barely holding on. Parents are pulling their kids out, and the ones that stay, well, They're scared. Hell, I'm scared. What are we supposed to tell them? Tom leaned against the wall, arms crossed, staring out the window into the dark night. We fight, he said quietly. We fight for what's ours. Frank Mitchell, seated next to his brother Harry, shook his head. Fight with what? Look at us, Tom. We're getting older. We've got rifles, sure, but this isn't a game anymore. These guys, they're not like the border crossers we used to deal with. These are killers. Tom clenched his jaw, anger simmering just beneath the surface. I know that, Frank. But what do you want me to do? Just sit here and watch them take everything? Watch them destroy this town? Harry spoke up, his voice gruff but resigned. Maybe we should leave. I don't want to, but maybe it's time to face facts. The cartel isn't going anywhere. We can't protect Mortionville anymore. Not like this. The room fell into a heavy silence. It was the unspoken fear that had been hanging over all of them for weeks. Mortionville was falling, and the 6 men who had once stood as its protectors were powerless to stop it. As the cartel dug in deeper, the violence escalated. It started with small incidents, threats made in the middle of the night, a brick thrown through a store window, a local man beaten when he refused to pay the cartel's protection fee. But it wasn't long before things took a darker turn. One evening, the Mitchell brothers were out on a patrol near the edge of town. They'd taken to patrolling in pairs now, knowing full well that the days of solo patrols were long gone. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the desert, when they noticed a group of men gathered by an old abandoned shack on the outskirts of Mortionville. It wasn't unusual to see people out there, but something about the way these men moved, the way they kept looking over their shoulders, set off alarm bells in Frank's mind. Let's check it out, he said to Harry, who nodded in agreement. They drove closer, parking their truck a few hundred yards away and approaching on foot. As they got nearer, the unmistakable sound of raised voices reached their ears. And then, gunfire. Without hesitation, Frank and Harry ducked behind a boulder, their hearts racing. Peeking over the edge, they saw the men scrambling, loading large black bags into trucks. It didn't take long for Frank to realize what was happening. They're running drugs, Frank whispered. Right under our noses. Harry's face was pale as he looked at his brother. What do? We can't take them all. We need to call Tom, get everyone down here. We can. Before Frank could finish, the sharp crack of a gunshot rang out, and Harry collapsed to the ground beside him. Time seemed to slow as Frank looked down at his brother, blood pooling beneath him. Panic surged through him, but he didn't have time to think. Another shot whizzed past his head, and he knew they had been spotted. Frantically, he grabbed Harry's arm, dragging him back toward the truck. His heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through him as he fired a few blind shots over his shoulder, hoping to buy them some time. But he knew, deep down, it was too late. By the time Frank reached the truck, Harry was barely conscious, his breath shallow and ragged. Frank drove as fast as he could, trying to get his brother to safety, but the desert was unforgiving, and the town was too far. Harry died before they made it back. The news of Harry Mitchell's death hit Mortionville hard. It was the first real casualty of the cartel's arrival, and it shattered what little hope the town had left. The funeral was small, quiet, attended only by the remaining members of the Guardians and a handful of townsfolk who hadn't yet fled. The once lively Mitchell Brothers hardware store closed its doors for good. Frank was never the same after that. His grief turned to anger, and his anger turned to a need for revenge. But he wasn't the only one. The entire town was on edge, waiting for the next attack, the next life to be lost. Tom Wallace tried to hold it all together, but even he felt the weight of it bearing down on him. His once peaceful town was turning into a war zone, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop the tide from rising. He had lost one of his tense town meeting where people had begun openly talking about leaving Mortionville. Tom sat alone in his kitchen, a bottle of whiskey in front of him. The house was silent, the only sound the faint creak of the wind pushing against the old wooden shutters. His wife had gone to bed hours ago, but Tom couldn't sleep. The town was slipping through his fingers. He had spent his life protecting Mortionville, building something good here, and now, in the twilight of his years, he was watching it fall apart. He poured himself another drink, the amber liquid catching the dim light from the kitchen bulb. His mind wandered to Mike Tanner, to Harry Mitchell, to the men who had been there with him from the start. They had all believed that Mortionville was different, that it could be kept safe from the dangers of the outside world. But they had been wrong. Tom took a long drink, his eyes staring blankly at the table in front of him. The fight was coming, and it was one they couldn't win. In the distance, a gunshot echoed through the quiet night, a grim reminder of what their world had become. Mortionville was no longer the town it once was. It was a town under siege. And the worst was yet to come. Chapter 5, A Town Under Siege. The siege of Mortionville wasn't a sudden, dramatic event, it was a slow, creeping invasion. By the time most of the townspeople realized what was happening, the cartel was already embedded, their control spreading like a cancer. At first, the cartel had operated on the outskirts, using intimidation and fear to get what they wanted. But after Harry Mitchell's death, they became bolder, more brazen in their actions. Mortionville had always been a place where neighbors helped each other, where people cared. But fear changes people, and now, the sense of community that had once defined the town was being replaced by something darker. People kept to themselves, avoiding eye contact, no longer lingering for conversations at the diner or in front of the post office. The streets were quieter than they had ever been, eerily so. And the cartel was everywhere. They didn't make a spectacle of themselves, but their presence was felt. They moved through the town like shadows, silent, watchful, waiting for anyone to step out of line. Local businesses were forced to pay for protection. Refusing meant violence, plain and simple. Some tried to resist at first. Mr. Jenkins, who owned the general store, was found beaten unconscious one night after refusing to pay. His store was burned down the next week. Others got the message quickly. Pay, or suffer the consequences. Tom Wallace and the remaining guardians did their best to keep things from completely spiraling out of control, but it felt like they were plugging holes in a sinking ship. The cartel was more organized, better armed, and willing to do whatever it took to secure their grip on Mortionville. And while the town was being strangled from within, the outside world continued to ignore them. Calls for help went unanswered. The sheriff's office was a joke, just a few deputies who were too afraid to intervene. State authorities had bigger issues to deal with in the larger cities, and the federal government had long since abandoned small border towns like Mortionville. Tom and his men were truly on their own. The next blow came 2 weeks after Harry Mitchell's funeral. It was a Sunday morning, and the diner was as full as it could be under the circumstances. Families still tried to keep up a semblance of normalcy, gathering for breakfast after church, but the tension in the air was palpable, keeping his voice low. "We can't keep going like this, Tom. The town's falling apart, and we're just sitting here, waiting for the hammer to drop." Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know. But what can we do? We don't have the manpower, the weapons, hell, we don't even have the town behind us anymore. People are scared, Dan. They're scared, and I don't blame them." Before Dan could respond, the door to the diner swung open, and a hush fell over the room. A group of cartel men walked in, led by the same scarred man who had visited them weeks earlier. His presence sent a ripple of unease through the diner. Conversations stopped. All eyes were on him as he strolled casually toward the counter, acting like he owned the place. In a way, he did. Tom's hand instinctively went to the pistol he had concealed under his jacket, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. The tension in the air was thick, and he knew one wrong move could set off a bloodbath. The cartel leader smiled coldly as he reached the counter, leaning against it as he addressed the waitress behind the bar. "We'll take a few coffees, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "And put it on the house. You don't mind, do you?" The waitress, a woman named Ellie who had worked at the diner for as long as Tom could remember, shook her head, her hands trembling as she reached for the coffee pot. No, of course not." The cartel men took seats at the counter, their presence casting a shadow over the entire diner. Tom felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to remain calm. He could feel Dan tensing up beside him, and he placed a hand on his friend's arm, a silent warning to stay still. "This isn't right," Dan whispered, his voice tight with anger. We can't just let them walk in here like they own the place. They do, Tom replied bitterly. And if we try something now, people are going to get hurt. Dan's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. The cartel men made themselves comfortable, laughing and talking as if they were out for a casual breakfast. But the tension in the room was suffocating. Everyone was on edge, waiting for something to happen, praying that it wouldn't. And then, it did. The violence started as suddenly as a summer storm. One of the local men, Johnny Phelps, had had enough. Johnny was young, barely in his 20s, and he wasn't the type to back down. His father had been a rancher, proud and stubborn, and Johnny had inherited that same fiery spirit. He had been glaring at the cartel men from the moment they walked in, his knuckles white as he gripped his coffee mug. Tom noticed it too late. Johnny stood up from his table, knocking over his chair in the process, and marched toward the cartel leader. His fists were clenched at his sides, his face flushed with rage. "You think you can just come in here and take whatever you want?" Johnny shouted, his voice shaking with anger. "This is our town. You don't belong here." The diner went dead silent. Tom's heart dropped into his stomach. The scarred cartel leader didn't even flinch. He turned slowly on his stool, fixing Johnny with a cold, calculating stare. His lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And what are you going to do about it, kid?" the cartel leader asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Johnny didn't hesitate. He swung. His fist connected with the cartel leader's face, and for a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. The sound of the punch echoed through the diner, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The cartel men jumped to their feet, drawing guns before anyone could react. Johnny swung again, but this time he was met with the butt of a rifle to the side of his head. He crumpled to the floor, blood pouring from a gash above his eye. Screams filled the diner as people scrambled to take cover, overturning tables and ducking behind counters. Ellie, the waitress, screamed as one of the cartel men shoved her out of the way, his gun aimed at Johnny's crumpled form. Tom didn't think. He drew his pistol, his hand steady even as his heart raced. He fired once, hitting the cartel man in the shoulder, sending him staggering back. But there were too many of them. Gunfire erupted, bullets ripping through the diner, shattering windows and splintering wood. Dan was beside him, firing his own gun, but it was chaos. People were screaming, glass was flying, and Tom knew they were outgunned. He took cover behind an overturned table, his mind racing, knowing that this was the moment they had all feared. The violence they had tried to keep at bay had finally exploded. And Mortionville was paying the price. The gunfight didn't last long, but the damage was done. When the smoke cleared, the diner was a wreck. The once cozy booths were riddled with bullet holes, the walls peppered with shattered glass. Blood pooled on the floor, and the sound of sobbing filled the air. Johnny Phelps lay in a crumpled heap, his body motionless. Ellie was kneeling beside him, her hands covered in blood as she tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. Johnny was gone. Tom stood in the wreckage, his gun still in his hand, staring at the scene around him. The cartel leader had escaped, along with his men, but they had left their mark. This was the beginning of the end for Mortionville. The battle for the town had truly begun, and it wasn't going to stop until the streets ran red. Chapter 6: Blood in the Streets. The sun had barely risen the next morning when the town of Mortionville woke to the reality that the bloodshed in the diner was just the beginning. Word spread fast about Johnny Phelps, the young man who had tried to stand up to the cartel and paid for it with his life. It was the first open battle, but everyone knew it wouldn't be the last. The air in town was thick with fear. Some families packed what they could into their cars and left without saying goodbye, choosing the safety of the unknown over the certainty of violence. Others stayed behind, unsure of what to do or where to go, hoping that somehow things would get better. But Mortionville's future was bleak, and deep down, even the most stubborn of the residents knew that this was the beginning of the end. Tom Wallace stood outside the wrecked diner, surveying the damage. His heart was heavy as he looked at the bullet-riddled windows and overturned tables. What had once been the heart of the town, a place where families gathered and friends shared meals, was now a symbol of the chaos that had engulfed Mortionville. Next to him, Dan Russo lit a cigarette, the smoke curling into the morning air. He didn't say anything, just stared at the bloodstains on the ground, his face etched with the same grim realization that had been weighing on Tom for weeks. "They'll be back," Dan said finally, his voice low and rough. "We both know it." Tom nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yeah, they will. And next time, it'll be worse." The sound of approaching footsteps broke their silence, and Tom turned to see John Morris walking toward them. The schoolteacher looked older than his years, his face drawn and pale. He had been there the night before, hiding behind a counter when the bullets started flying, but Tom could see in his eyes that the experience had changed him. "They're holding a town meeting," John said, his voice flat. "Everyone who's still here is coming. People want to know what's going to happen." Tom sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "What can we tell them? That the cartel's taken over? That there's no one coming to save us?" John didn't respond. He didn't have to. They all knew the truth. The meeting took place in the town hall later that afternoon. The air inside was thick with tension, and every creak of the wooden floorboards seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet room. The remaining townspeople, those who hadn't fled in the night, gathered in the old building, their faces lined with fear and uncertainty. Tom, Dan, John, and Frank Mitchell stood at the front, facing the crowd. These were the people they had grown up with, their friends and neighbors, but now they were looking to them for answers they didn't have. Tom cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice steady though his heart was racing. "We all know what happened last night," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "Johnny Phelps is dead. The cartels made their move, and it's clear they're not going to stop until they've taken everything." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of anger and fear. Tom could see the pain in their faces, the way some of them flinched at the mention of Johnny's name. He took a deep breath and continued. "We've been trying to protect this town for years, but we can't do it alone. The truth is, we're outnumbered, outgunned, and the government doesn't give a damn about what's happening here. We've been abandoned." A woman in the front row, her eyes red from crying, stood up. It was Mrs. Phelps, Johnny's mother. Her voice was filled with grief, but also with fury. "So what are we supposed to do, Tom? Just sit here and wait for them to come for us? My boy's dead because of them. Are we supposed to just let them take our town?" Tom's chest tightened. He had no answer for her, not one that would make any difference. "We fight," he said, his voice firm. "We fight to protect what's ours. But I won't lie to you, it won't be easy, and it won't be without cost." Dan stepped forward, his face hard. "If you want to leave, no one's going to stop you. But if you stay, you'd better be ready for what's coming. This town's a war zone now." The room fell into a heavy silence as everyone absorbed the weight of Dan's words. They had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real. There was no escaping the truth. Mortionville was no longer a peaceful border town. It was a battleground. As the days passed, the violence escalated. The cartel wasn't content with what they had, they wanted to send a message. They started making more frequent, bold moves. Storefronts were shot up in the middle of the night, homes were vandalized, and anyone who resisted was either beaten or worse. The cartel wanted Mortionville to know that they owned the town, and every day, they tightened their grip just a little more. Tom and his remaining crew tried to hold the line, but it was like fighting a wildfire with a garden hose. They did what they could, patrolling the streets at night, keeping an eye on the remaining businesses, and trying to offer protection to the few families who hadn't fled, but it was a losing battle. The cartel had numbers, firepower, and a ruthlessness that the town had never seen before. One night, the town was awakened by the sound of gunfire coming from the north side of town, near the church. Tom, Dan, and Frank grabbed their rifles and rushed toward the sound, their hearts pounding in their chests. When they arrived, they found the church engulfed in flames, the orange glow lighting up the night sky. A group of cartel men stood nearby, watching the fire with cold indifference. Tom didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired, dropping one of the men before they could react. The others scattered, returning fire as they disappeared into the darkness. The battle was brief, but by the time the cartel had fled, the damage was done. The church was gone, reduced to ashes. Tom stood in front of the burning building, his rifle still in his hands, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The flames reflected in his eyes as he watched the last piece of Mortionville's soul go up in smoke. He had grown up in that church. He had watched his children get baptized there, seen friends married, buried loved ones. And now, it was gone. "We're losing," Dan said quietly, standing beside him. Tom didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth was in the fire in front of them, in the blood on the streets, in the empty houses and the shattered windows. Mortionville was dying. In the days that followed the church burning, the cartel ramped up their attacks. It wasn't about money anymore, it was about control, about breaking the spirit of the town once and for all. They started targeting the families of anyone who resisted. Homes were broken into, people dragged out in the middle of the night, their screams echoing through the dark streets. One by one, the remaining families packed up and left. There was no longer any question about staying. The fight for Mortionville was over, and the cartel had won. By the end of the week, only a handful of people remained in town. Tom, Dan, John, and a few others. They had lost everything: friends, neighbors, homes. The town that had once been a sanctuary was now a war-torn wasteland. The final blow came on a rainy night, the kind of night that used to be rare in Mortionville. Tom and his remaining crew were holed up in the town hall, their last stronghold. Outside, the rain poured down, turning the streets to mud, but even the storm couldn't drown out the sound of gunfire in the distance. "They're coming," Dan muttered, loading his rifle. "This is it." Tom nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. There was no stopping it now. The cartel had taken everything, and tonight, they would take what was left. The doors to the town hall burst open, and the cartel stormed in, guns blazing. Tom and his men fired back, but it was over before it even started. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of time. As Tom lay bleeding on the cold floor of the town hall, the sounds of the final gunfight echoing around him, he thought of everything they had fought for. The town, the people, the memories. All of it was gone now. Mortionville was no more. Chapter 7: The Fall of Mortionville. The rain fell in heavy sheets, pounding the broken streets of Mortionville with relentless fury. The storm was unlike anything the town had seen in years, a fitting end to a place that had once been full of life but was now nothing more than a dying echo of its former self. The rain mixed with the blood on the pavement, washing away the last remnants of the battle that had just been fought. Inside the town hall, the sound of footsteps echoed across the wooden floor, the creak of old wood groaning under the weight of the inevitable. Tom Wallace lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling as blood seeped from the gunshot wound in his side. His vision blurred, but his mind was clear. He knew this was the end. There was no cavalry coming, no last-minute rescue. Mortionville, the town he had given his life to protect, had fallen. Around him, the bodies of his friends lay still. Dan Russo had been the first to go down, shot through the chest in the first wave of the cartel's final assault. John Morris had fought bravely but had been overwhelmed, his lifeless form slumped against the wall near the doorway. Frank Mitchell, his brother Harry long gone, had gone down in a hail of gunfire, refusing to retreat even as the bullets tore through him. Now it was just Tom, the last man standing, if you could call lying on the floor, bleeding out, standing. The town hall, once the center of Mortionville's community, was now a tomb, silent except for the rain beating against the windows. The cartel had swept through the town like a plague. What had started as intimidation, as threats and bribes, had escalated into full-scale occupation. Mortionville, once peaceful and united, had become a battlefield, and Tom's side had lost. They had all lost. Through the haze of pain, Tom heard the door creak open again, and the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone entering the room. He tried to move, to raise his pistol, but his strength was gone. His hand fell limp to his side, the gun slipping from his grasp. The figure stopped in front of him, towering over him like a shadow. Tom squinted, trying to make out the face of his visitor. It didn't take long for recognition to settle in. The scarred man, the leader of the cartel, the one who had walked into the diner and made it clear that Mortionville would never be the same, stood above him, his cold eyes staring down at Tom without a trace of pity. "Looks like it's over, old man," the cartel leader said, his voice low and smooth. He crouched down, bringing his face closer to Tom's, as if to make sure his words sank in. You and your boys put up a good fight, I'll give you that. But this town, it was never yours to save. Tom's breath came in ragged gasps, every inhale bringing a sharp pain through his chest. He wanted to say something, to curse the man standing before him, but the words wouldn't come. He was too tired. Too broken. The cartel leader shook his head and stood up, looking around the ruined town hall with a smirk. You should have known when to walk away, Wallace. You should have left while you had the chance. Tom blinked slowly, his vision dimming. He couldn't look away from the man who had taken everything from him, from his town. But in his heart, he knew this was the end. The town hall had fallen. His friends were dead. And Mortionville had been doomed the moment the cartel had set their eyes on it. As Tom's consciousness began to fade, his thoughts drifted back to the days before all of this. He saw the faces of the people he had known all his life, smiling and laughing, unaware of the darkness that was waiting just beyond the horizon. He remembered the way the town used to be, full of life and love and peace. He had fought so hard to protect that, to keep Mortionville safe. But in the end, it hadn't been enough. Nothing could stop what had come. Outside, the rain continued to pour, washing the blood from the streets, carrying away the last traces of the battle that had torn Mortionville apart. The cartel had taken over completely now, their men patrolling the streets like vultures circling a carcass. The few remaining townspeople who hadn't fled were holed up in their homes, too afraid to step outside, too afraid to fight back. The town that had once been their sanctuary had become their prison. Ms. McCracken, the town's schoolteacher, sat in her small house on the edge of town, staring out the window at the rain. She had lived in Mortionville her entire life, had seen it grow from a tiny border town into a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's names. She had taught generations of children, watched them grow up, get married, and have children of their own. And now, she was watching it all crumble. She hadn't left when the others did. Maybe she should have, but she couldn't bring herself to abandon the only home she had ever known. Even now, with the cartel running the town, with the streets empty and silent, she couldn't leave. A knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. Her heart raced as she stood, hesitating for a moment before slowly crossing the room to open it. She knew who it was before she even reached the door. The cartel leader stood on her porch, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. His face was as cold and expressionless as ever, his eyes dark and soulless. Behind him stood two armed men, their rifles slung over their shoulders, waiting. Ms. McCracken swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she gripped the doorknob. I'm here to collect, the cartel leader said, his voice calm, almost casual. We need this place now. We'll give you 5 minutes to get out. Ms. McCracken felt a wave of anger rise up inside her, a fire that hadn't burned this fiercely in years. You can't just. He cut her off, his eyes narrowing. Don't waste your breath, lady. I don't care what you think. You've had your time here. It's over now. She stared at him, her lips trembling as the weight of his words sank in. This was it. The end of everything. The town, the school, the lives they had built here, gone. Just like that. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She wasn't going to let this man see her cry. Not now. Not after everything. What the hell happened to us? She whispered, more to herself than to him. We became so complacent. The cartel leader raised an eyebrow. What was that? She straightened her shoulders, staring him dead in the eye. We became complacent, she repeated, her voice steadier now. We thought we were untouchable. And look where it got us. The cartel leader didn't respond, his gaze cold and uncaring. Then, without warning, he pulled a gun from his belt, aimed it at the back of Ms. McCracken's head, and pulled the trigger. She crumpled to the ground, her body lying motionless on the porch as the rain poured down around her. The cartel leader holstered his gun and turned to his men. Burn it, he said simply, before walking away. As the flames engulfed Ms. McCracken's house, the last remnants of Mortionville went up in smoke. The town that had once been full of life, of hope, was now nothing more than ashes. And in the end, there was no one left to remember it. Chapter 8. complacency and tragedy. The smoke that rose from Ms. McCracken's burning house seemed to signal the final death knell for Mawsonville. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the streets slick with mud and the faint, lingering smell of charred wood hanging in the air. What was left of the town now was no longer recognizable, a shell of its former self, gutted by violence and fear, overrun by a cartel that had claimed it like a vulture picking at the bones of the dead. Tom Wallace's body was found later that day, along with the other men who had tried, against all odds, to protect the place they had called home for so many years. A group of cartel soldiers tossed their bodies into the back of a truck, indifferent to the sacrifices they had made or the years of service they had given to Mawsonville. To the cartel, they were just obstacles, easily removed, easily forgotten. And in a way, that's how it felt to the world beyond Mawsonville. The town had been small, insignificant to most, just another border town caught in the crossfire of larger, more important battles. In the grand scheme of things, who would care about a place like Mawsonville? Who would mourn its loss? Yet, for those who had once called it home, the fall of Mawsonville was nothing short of a tragedy. Days turned into weeks, and the few remaining families who had stayed through the cartel's takeover quietly packed up and left. The last to go were the Johnsons, an elderly couple who had lived on the outskirts of town, too stubborn to leave until now. They had watched as their neighbors fled, as the town emptied, but now, with the cartel in full control, they had no choice but to leave as well. As they drove out of Mawsonville, passing the charred remains of the church and the ruins of the once busy diner, they couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. This had been their home for decades. They had raised children here, watched grandchildren play in the dusty streets. And now, it was all gone. The road out of town was long and empty, stretching toward the horizon with nothing but desert on either side. They didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. The U.S. government eventually sent officials to investigate the violence in Mawsonville, but by then, it was too late. The cartel had fully embedded itself in the town, turning it into a hub for its operations. The officials took a few notes, snapped a few photos, but in the end, nothing came of it. No one was held accountable, and no one intervened. Mawsonville became just another casualty in the larger war being fought along the border. It wasn't the first town to fall to the cartel, and it wouldn't be the last. It had simply been forgotten, left to rot under the oppressive thumb of those who now claimed it. But there were those who would never forget. In a small town a few hundred miles away, a group of survivors from Mawsonville gathered in a diner not unlike the one that had once been the heart of their own town. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces etched with the grief of those who had lost everything. One of them, a man named Carl, had been one of the first to leave when the violence began. He hadn't wanted to go, he had grown up in Mawsonville, just like Tom Wallace and the others, but he had a family to protect. He hadn't been able to stay and fight, though he often wondered what would have happened if he had. "We should have done more," Carl said, staring into his coffee. His voice was thick with regret. "We should have fought harder." A woman sitting across from him, her eyes red from crying, shook her head. "You saw what they did to the others, Carl. They were merciless. We would have died, just like Tom and Harry and the rest." Carl clenched his fists, the guilt heavy in his chest. "But we let them take it. We let them take our home." The woman looked down, her hands trembling as she wiped away a tear. "We didn't let them. We had no choice." There was a silence, heavy and filled with the weight of what had been lost. Around the table, the others nodded in quiet agreement. They had all loved Mawsonville. They had all believed that somehow their small town would be safe from the violence that plagued so many other places. They had believed in the strength of their community, in the unity that had always defined them. But that unity had been shattered, and with it, the illusion that Mawsonville was untouchable. The legacy of Mawsonville wasn't one of heroism or triumph. It wasn't a story of brave men standing against impossible odds and winning. It was a story of complacency, of believing that the peace they had known would last forever. It was a story of how good people, when faced with overwhelming darkness, can still fall. And fall they did. The cartel's control of the town grew stronger with each passing day, and soon Mawsonville became a name known only in whispers, a place where no one dared to venture. The buildings crumbled, the streets became overgrown with weeds, and the once tight-knit community was scattered to the winds. It became a ghost town in the truest sense, a place haunted by the memories of what had once been and by the ghosts of those who had fought to protect it. Years later, an old map of Texas still bore the name Mortionville, though no roads led there anymore. It was a forgotten dot on the border, a place swallowed by the desert and by the violence that had overtaken it. Travelers passing through the area didn't know its history. They didn't know about the men who had tried to protect it, about the families who had once made it a home, or about the day the cartel had come and turned it into a place of death. But for those who had lived through it, the memories lingered. They would never forget the faces of their friends and neighbors. They would never forget the feeling of walking down the streets, knowing that everything they had ever loved was slipping away. They would never forget the moment they realized that no one was coming to save them. As the sun set over the Texas desert, casting long shadows across the land, the last remnants of Mortionville lay in ruin. The wind whistled through the empty buildings, carrying with it the echoes of a town that had once been, but was now no more. And in the end, the only thing left of Mortionville were the stories told by the survivors, stories of a town that had been full of life, of people who had loved one another, and of the day when that love wasn't enough to save them.
The Phantom of Palatka. In the quaint town of Palatka, nestled along the banks of the St. John's River, there was a legend as old as the Spanish moss hanging from the ancient oaks, a legend of the Phantom of Palatka. The story was whispered in hushed tones among the townsfolk, passed down from one generation to the next, each retelling adding a new layer to the mystery. But for the first time in decades, the phantom would become more than a tale, he would become a reality. Chapter 1: The Ghost of the Past. The Phantom, once known as Elias, was a soldier who returned to Palatka during the Civil War, only to find his hometown ravaged and his loved ones gone. Consumed by despair, Elias retreated into the swamps, where he was believed to have perished. Yet his spirit never left, haunting the town as a mere shadow, a reminder of a past filled with pain. For years, Elias was nothing more than a fleeting presence, a cold breeze, a flicker of movement, harmless, but always there, a silent testament to the town's tragic history. Chapter 2: A Glimpse of Light. Leela, a young artist, moved to Palatka, captivated by its beauty. She wasn't afraid of the old tales, instead, they intrigued her. One evening, while sketching along the riverbank, she saw a figure standing on the opposite shore, half hidden in shadows. Rather than flee, Leela felt an inexplicable connection to the figure and began returning to that spot, speaking to him even though he never replied. Over time, the figure, Elias, began to emerge more into the light, drawn by Leela's warmth and openness. Though still shrouded in darkness, something within him stirred, something that had been dormant for so long. Chapter 3: The Blossoming Affection. As the weeks passed, Elias began to step closer to Leela, and she started to sense the depth of his loneliness. She felt an unspoken bond forming between them, though she couldn't fully understand it. One evening, she crossed the river to stand beside him, offering her hand in a gesture of connection. For the first time in decades, Elias felt the warmth of another human being, and with it, a glimmer of hope. Chapter 4: The Rejection. But as Leela's feelings deepened, so too did her fear and confusion. The townspeople noticed her absences and began to warn her of the dangers of consorting with a ghost. One evening, standing beside Elias, Leela realized the vast divide between them. He was bound by the past, while she was full of life. Overwhelmed, she pulled away, whispering, "I can't love a ghost." Elias's fragile hope shattered. The warmth he had felt was ripped away, and he retreated back into the shadows, his heart breaking once more. Chapter 5: The Descent into Darkness. Leela's rejection reopened old wounds within Elias, wounds that had never truly healed. His sorrow turned to rage, and he withdrew into the swamps. The townspeople soon noticed his absence, but instead of peace, they were met with a growing sense of dread. Elias's pain demanded retribution. The peaceful figure who once haunted the town in silence became a harbinger of terror. Animals were found slaughtered, crops withered, and those who ventured too close to the swamps returned with tales of a shadow that followed them. Palatka was gripped by fear, knowing they had angered something beyond their control. Chapter 6: The Phantom's Wrath. The town's fear grew as Elias's vengeance escalated. He became a shadowy figure who appeared on the edges of the town, his presence a constant reminder of the terror he brought. Those who had warned Leela began to suffer. Mysterious accidents, unexplained illnesses, and disappearances became common. Palatka was slowly strangled by the fear of the unknown, of a spirit consumed by darkness. Chapter 7: A Final Plea. Haunted by guilt, Leela knew she had to act. The town was falling apart, and it was her fault. Desperate, she returned to the riverbank, calling out to Elias. He emerged from the shadows, his eyes now filled with cold fury. "You gave me hope," he said, "and then you tore it away." Tears streaming down her face, Leela pleaded for the town, offering her own life in exchange for their safety. Elias hesitated, the rage in his eyes flickering. He knelt beside her, lifting her chin to look into her eyes. "Do you think your life is worth the cost of my torment?" he asked softly. Leela, sobbing, whispered, "Yes, if it will save them." For a moment, Elias seemed to waver, his heart aching at the sight of her pain. But the darkness within him was too deep, too consuming. "It's too late," he said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I cannot be saved, and neither can they." As Lila's sobs echoed in the night, Elias slowly faded into the shadows, leaving her alone by the riverbank. The town of Palatka, now cursed by the Phantom's wrath, would never be the same. Lila's sacrifice had come too late, and the legend of the Phantom of Palatka would live on, a story of love, loss, and the price of despair. Chapter 8: The Aftermath. The town of Palatka, once a peaceful haven by the St. John's River, was now a place of perpetual gloom. The air was thick with sorrow, the people subdued by the weight of what had transpired. Leela, though still living, was a shell of her former self. She walked the streets of Palatka, haunted by her memories and the knowledge that she had failed to save the town or the man who had once been Elias. The strange occurrences that had plagued the town began to taper off, but the damage had been done, the crops never fully recovered, and the once lively riverbank remained eerily quiet, avoided by all but the most reckless. The townsfolk spoke less and less of the Phantom, hoping that by ignoring the past, they could somehow move forward. But the shadow of Elias lingered, and Palatka was forever marked by the tragedy that had unfolded. Leela spent her days in solitude, painting the landscapes of her broken heart, dark, melancholic scenes of the swamps, the river, and the figure who haunted her dreams. Her art, once vibrant and full of life, became a reflection of her inner turmoil. The townspeople, who had once marveled at her talent, now regarded her with pity, seeing in her the embodiment of the town's curse. Chapter 9: A Glimmer of Redemption. Years passed, and the story of the Phantom of Palatka faded into legend once more, a tale told only in whispers to frightened children. But Leela, now older and worn by time, could not escape the past. She returned to the riverbank every evening, just as she had when she first encountered Elias, her heart heavy with regret. One autumn night, as the first cold winds began to sweep through the town, Leela stood by the river, her thoughts consumed by memories. She closed her eyes, feeling the familiar chill in the air, when suddenly, she sensed a presence beside her. Her heart raced, and she opened her eyes to find Elias standing there, his figure still shrouded in darkness, but less menacing than before. "I've waited for you," Leela whispered, her voice trembling. "I've waited all these years, hoping you would come back." Elias remained silent, his expression unreadable. But there was something different about him, something softer, less consumed by the rage that had once driven him. Leela reached out a trembling hand, just as she had done all those years ago. "I'm so sorry," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I was young and foolish, and I didn't understand. I never meant to hurt you." Elias's hand hovered above hers, and for a moment, it seemed as if he might take it. But then he pulled away, the distance between them too great to bridge. "It's too late for us, Leela," Elias said, his voice filled with a sorrow that echoed through the night. The past cannot be undone, and the pain we've caused each other is too deep. I am no longer the man I once was, and you are not the girl who first came to this town. Lila's heart broke anew, but she knew he was right. They were both different now, shaped by the choices they had made and the consequences that had followed. The love they had felt, or what might have been love, was lost to time. I understand, Lila whispered, her voice barely audible. But I want you to know that I never stopped caring, I never stopped hoping that somehow, you could find peace. Elias looked at her, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch across the centuries. Peace is not something I can have, Lila. Not in this world. But perhaps, knowing that you cared, it's enough to ease the burden I carry. With those words, Elias began to fade, his form becoming more insubstantial with each passing second. Lila watched, tears streaming down her face, as the phantom of Palatka disappeared into the night, leaving her alone once more. Epilogue: the legend lives on. In the years that followed, the town of Palatka slowly began to heal. The land, though scarred, became fertile again, and the people learned to smile, though their eyes still held a trace of the sorrow they had endured. The legend of the phantom became just that, a legend, something told by the fireside on dark nights, a cautionary tale of love, loss, and the dangers of meddling with the unknown. Lila lived out her days quietly, her art reflecting the depth of her soul. She never married, never had children, but she found a measure of peace in her solitude, knowing that she had done what she could to make amends. When she passed away, her paintings, dark and beautiful, were all that remained, a testament to the life she had lived and the man she had loved. The phantom of Palatka was never seen again, but the townspeople still whispered his name on cold, misty nights, believing that he might still be out there, watching, waiting. And perhaps, in some way, he was, forever bound to the town he could never truly leave, and to the woman who had once touched his heart.
Beyond the Walls. The Dark Reality of Central Florida Behavioral Health. Beyond the Walls is an eye-opening exposé that delves into the disturbing conditions within Central Florida Behavioral Health, a mental health facility that has garnered comparisons to supermax prisons due to its harsh and punitive practices. Through detailed patient testimonies, investigative research, and legal analysis, the book reveals how a place intended for healing has become a site of systemic neglect, abuse, and trauma. The dark side of mental health care. Central Florida Behavioral Health was established to provide care and support for individuals struggling with mental health issues. However, the reality within its walls is far from this mission. Patients entering the facility, often in vulnerable states, are met with an environment characterized by control, confinement, and fear rather than compassion and treatment. The facility's practices have drawn stark parallels to those used in supermax prisons, where control and isolation are prioritized over rehabilitation. Patients at Central Florida Behavioral Health describe a daily routine marked by rigid schedules, constant surveillance, and a complete lack of autonomy. The use of restraints, both physical and chemical, and isolation as methods of managing patient behavior are particularly troubling. These measures, intended to subdue and control, often exacerbate the very conditions they are meant to treat, leading to severe psychological trauma. Personal testimonies, voices from inside. The book is filled with harrowing accounts from former patients who detail their traumatic experiences within the facility. These testimonies paint a picture of a place where patients are often overmedicated to the point of sedation, restrained for minor infractions, and isolated for extended periods. Many patients describe feeling dehumanized, abandoned, and betrayed by a system that was supposed to help them heal. One former patient, Samantha, recounts how her initial hope for recovery quickly turned into a nightmare as she was subjected to heavy sedation and isolation. Another patient, John, compares his experience to being imprisoned, stating that the facility's atmosphere of control and fear made it feel more like a punishment than a place of healing. These personal stories underscore the broader systemic issues within the facility, highlighting the profound impact these practices have on the mental and emotional well-being of patients. Legal battles and regulatory failures. Central Florida Behavioral Health's troubling practices have not gone unnoticed. The facility has faced numerous legal battles, with patients and their families seeking justice for the mistreatment and neglect that occurred within its walls. These lawsuits, coupled with regulatory investigations, have exposed the facility's failures to provide adequate care and uphold patient rights. Despite these legal challenges, the facility has continued to operate, raising questions about the effectiveness of regulatory oversight in the mental health care industry. Advocacy groups have played a critical role in pushing for accountability and reform, yet the facility's ability to persist in the face of such scrutiny highlights the deep-rooted issues within the system. The need for systemic reform. Beyond the Walls is not just an exposé, it is a call to action. The book emphasizes the urgent need for comprehensive reform in the mental health care system. This includes stronger oversight, better training for staff, and the implementation of patient-centered care practices that prioritize healing over control. Advocacy groups, mental health professionals, and policymakers must work together to address the systemic failures that have allowed facilities like Central Florida Behavioral Health to operate without accountability. The stories of those who suffered within its walls serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of creating a mental health care system that truly supports and heals. Conclusion: a call for change. The harrowing accounts from Central Florida Behavioral Health underscore the critical need for change in how mental health care is provided. The comparisons to supermax prisons are not made lightly, they reflect a profound failure to treat individuals with the dignity and care they deserve. Beyond the Walls is a stark reminder that mental health care should be about compassion, support, and healing. The time for reform is now, and the stories of those who have endured the worst of the system must drive us toward a better future for all who seek help. The book closes with a call for collective action, urging individuals, communities, and policymakers to advocate for a mental health care system that is accountable, humane, and truly centered on the well-being of its patients. Only through such efforts can we ensure that no one else has to endure the nightmare experienced by so many at Central Florida Behavioral Health.
The Deadly Prom the Chorale is Given Sotri by Thomas Miller. Chapter 1. A Night to Remember. The year was 1967, and the British invasion had taken America by storm. The Dave Clark Fives hit over and over blared from every radio, including the one in the modest bedroom of Charles Givens. Posters of baseball legends and rock bands adorned the walls, mingling with pennants from various high school teams. Charles, a towering figure at 6'8" and 398 pounds, was an imposing presence. At 17, he was supposed to be preparing for one of the most memorable nights of his young life, his high school prom. But tonight, everything was about to go horrifically wrong. Charles had always been different. His size made him a target for bullies, and his quiet demeanour and peculiar habits kept him isolated. His mother, a strict and overbearing woman, had only made things worse. She insisted he take medication for his condition, though Charles never fully understood what was wrong with him. He had always felt the pills dulled his mind, and tonight he hadn't taken them. As he stood in front of the mirror in his white prom suit, his mother's voice echoed in his mind. "Charles, you don't need to worry about girls. With your condition, it's better if you don't think about sex. No one needs that in their life." The words stung, and something inside Charles snapped. He turned to see his mother standing in the doorway, her face twisted in disapproval. "Why do you have to be so cruel?" he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "What did you say?" his mother snapped. Before she could react, Charles grabbed the knife he had hidden under his pillow. His mother screamed, but it was too late. The knife plunged into her chest repeatedly, silencing her forever. Blood splattered across the room, but Charles remained eerily clean. His father, hearing the commotion, rushed into the room. "Charles, what have you done?" he shouted, trying to wrestle the knife from his son's grip. But Charles, fueled by a blind rage, overpowered him. The struggle was brief, and soon his father lay lifeless on the floor beside his mother. Breathing heavily, Charles stepped back, surveying the gruesome scene. The Dave Clark Fives over and over continued to play in the background, a macabre soundtrack to the carnage. He wiped the knife clean and calmly changed into a new suit, ensuring no blood marred his pristine appearance. Chapter 2. The Prom. The prom was in full swing when Charles arrived, his date, a sweet girl named Emily, had been waiting anxiously for him. She greeted him with a nervous smile, but something in Charles's eyes made her uneasy. "Are you okay, Charles?" she asked, noticing his cold, detached demeanor. "I'm fine," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "Let's dance." As they moved to the dance floor, the cheerful music clashed horribly with the dark thoughts swirling in Charles's mind. He could see his mother's disapproving face everywhere he looked, hear her voice condemning him. The pressure built inside him until he couldn't take it anymore. Without warning, Charles shoved Emily away and pulled the knife from his pocket. Screams erupted as he slashed wildly, the blade cutting through the air and flesh alike. Panic ensued and students fled in all directions, desperate to escape the bloodbath. The night ended in chaos. The police arrived too late to save the victims but managed to apprehend Charles before he could harm anyone else. As they dragged him away, he muttered to himself, his eyes glazed over. "I just wanted to dance." Chapter 3: The Building. Charles was sent to a psychiatric institution, where he remained for years, his mind lost in a haze of madness. But the legend of that fateful prom night lived on. The building where it all happened was abandoned, left to decay over the decades. Locals whispered that the ghost of Charles Givens still haunted the place, waiting for the next prom night. Strange occurrences began to happen. On the anniversary of the massacre, lights would flicker, and eerie music could be heard echoing through the empty halls. And then, one by one, teenagers started to disappear. Each year, a new group of students would gather, drawn by the morbid curiosity of the legend. They would sneak into the old building, daring each other to stay the night. But those who entered rarely came out. Their bodies were never found, only bloodstains and echoes of screams left behind. Some say Charles's spirit seeks revenge, forever trapped in the night of his last dance. Others believe he was possessed by something far darker, a malevolent force that still hungers for blood. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the horror of that prom night never truly ended. It merely waits, biding its time until the music starts again. And so, the legend of Charles Givens continues, a chilling reminder of how a night of celebration can turn into a nightmare. The building stands as a testament to the horrors that once unfolded there, a place where the past and present collide in a dance of death. Chapter 3: The Building. Charles was sent to a psychiatric institution, where he remained for years, his mind lost in a haze of madness. But the legend of that fateful prom night lived on. The building where it all happened was abandoned, left to decay over the decades. Locals whispered that the ghost of Charles Givens still haunted the place, waiting for the next prom night. Strange occurrences began to happen. On the anniversary of the massacre, lights would flicker, and eerie music could be heard echoing through the empty halls. And then, one by one, teenagers started to disappear. Each year, a new group of students would gather, drawn by the morbid curiosity of the legend. They would sneak into the old building, daring each other to stay the night. But those who entered rarely came out. Their bodies were never found, only bloodstains and echoes of screams left behind. Some say Charles's spirit seeks revenge, forever trapped in the night of his last dance. Others believe he was possessed by something far darker, a malevolent force that still hungers for blood. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the horror of that prom night never truly ended. It merely waits, biding its time until the music starts again. And so, the legend of Charles Givens continues, a chilling reminder of how a night of celebration can turn into a nightmare. The building stands as a testament to the horrors that once unfolded there, a place where the past and present collide in a dance of death. Chapter 4: Echoes of the Past. Years turned into decades, and the legend of Charles Givens became a cautionary tale told around campfires and whispered in high school hallways. New generations of students grew up hearing the macabre story, each adding their own embellishments. But as with all urban legends, the truth was far more terrifying than any fiction. In the spring of 2024, a group of adventurous teenagers from the local high school decided to investigate the old building on prom night. Among them was Jason, a history enthusiast who had spent months researching the true story of Charles Givens. He convinced his friends that the ghost stories were just myths, and they agreed to join him for a night of thrills and ghost hunting. The night was dark and stormy as they approached the dilapidated building. Lightning flashed, casting eerie shadows on the crumbling walls. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and the silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. "Are you sure this is a good idea, Emily?" Jason's girlfriend asked nervously. "Come on," Jason replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. "It's just an old building. Nothing to be scared of." The group made their way inside, their flashlights casting flickering beams of light on the dusty floors and peeling wallpaper. The ballroom, once a place of joy and celebration, was now a haunting ruin. Broken chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the once polished dance floor was covered in debris. Jason set up his equipment, determined to capture any paranormal activity. He placed an old cassette player in the center of the room and pressed play. The familiar tune of Over and Over and Over by the Dave Clark Five filled the air, sending shivers down their spines. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and a cold breeze swept through the room. The teenagers huddled together, their breath visible in the frigid air. The music began to distort, the cheerful melody turning into a sinister dirge. "Did you hear that, Mark?" one of Jason's friends whispered. They all heard it, a faint, echoing laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound grew louder, and the shadows on the walls began to twist and writhe as if they had a life of their own. "Let's get out of here," Emily cried, panic rising in her voice. But before they could move, the doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The laughter grew closer, more malevolent, and then they saw him, a tall, shadowy figure in a white prom suit, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "Charles Givens," Jason whispered, his voice trembling. The figure moved towards them, knife in hand. The air was filled with the sound of his heavy footsteps, each one echoing like a death knell. The teenagers were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or scream. Just as Charles raised the knife, the cassette player screeched to a halt, and the room was plunged into silence. The figure vanished, leaving the group in stunned horror. The doors creaked open, and a weak beam of moonlight illuminated their path to safety. Chapter 5: The Investigation. The teenagers fled the building, their hearts pounding in their chests. They vowed never to speak of what they had seen, but the experience haunted them. Jason, determined to uncover the truth, spent weeks poring over old newspapers and police reports. He discovered that Charles Givens had been buried in an unmarked grave, his body never properly laid to rest. Rumors circulated that his spirit was trapped, reliving that fateful prom night over and over again. Jason knew what he had to do. With the help of a local historian, Jason located the grave and organized a proper burial. They performed a simple ceremony, hoping to bring peace to the restless spirit. As they lowered the coffin into the ground, the sky cleared and a sense of calm washed over the cemetery. That night, the old building stood silent. The echoes of laughter and screams were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The legend of Charles Givens began to fade, and the disappearances on prom nights ceased. But the story of that fateful night remained, a chilling reminder of the horrors that can lurk in the shadows of our minds. As long as the building stood, it served as a testament to the dark past, a place where the echoes of the past could never truly be silenced. Epilogue: Ia, a warning. Years later, the building was finally demolished and a memorial was erected in its place. The townspeople hoped to move on, but the legend of Charles Givens lived on in their memories. It became a cautionary tale, a warning to future generations about the dangers of unchecked madness and the importance of compassion and understanding. For even the darkest souls can find peace, if only we have the courage to face our fears and seek the light within the shadows. And so, the story of Charles Givens became more than just a horror story, it became a lesson in humanity, reminding us that the line between sanity and madness is often thinner than we think.
A Love Interrupted. From the pen of Thomas Miller. The moon hung high in the sky, casting its silver glow over the room, softening the edges of everything it touched. The air was heavy with a stillness that could only exist in a dream, the kind of quiet that made every movement feel like an echo in eternity. I was there with her, the woman whose face I couldn't quite remember when I woke, yet in the dream, she was everything I'd ever wanted. The warmth of her body against mine, the way she breathed, how her hair spilled over the pillow like waves of dark silk. Everything felt right, until it didn't. We were entwined, our bodies moving together as if we'd always known each other in this intimate dance. Her touch was soft, her whispers gentle, and for a fleeting moment, I believed that maybe, just maybe, I was loved. But then, in the midst of it all, she stopped. At first, it was subtle, the way her hand slipped from mine, the way her breath hitched but not in pleasure, in hesitation. I looked into her eyes, trying to find the connection that had seemed so strong only seconds ago. Her face softened, not with love but with a kind of detachment, a distance that felt like a knife slicing through the haze of desire. "I'm done with you," she said softly, but her words echoed like thunder in the quiet room. I didn't understand. My body froze, my mind spinning with the confusion of it all. What had I done wrong? We were just there, lost in each other, and now this? She pulled away from me, the heat of her body replaced by a coldness that seeped into my skin. She smiled, not the smile I'd grown to cherish in the dream but a hollow, fake smile, the kind someone puts on for a picture that they know they'll never look at again. Click. It was as if a camera snapped the moment in time, capturing her disinterest, her dismissal, while I lay there, helpless and exposed. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't explain. She simply stood up, wrapped herself in her clothes, and walked away, leaving me there in the tangle of sheets and shattered hopes. I tried to call out to her, to ask why, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The words never came. All I could do was watch as she faded into the shadows of the room, her absence filling the space with a silence that was too loud to bear. When I woke, my chest was heavy, my heart pounding in a way that felt too real for something that happened in a dream. But wasn't that the cruelty of it all? It felt real. The rejection, the sudden end to something that had felt so beautiful, so intimate. I could still feel her touch, but now it burned like a brand, a reminder that even in my dreams, I wasn't enough. The worst part wasn't that it was a dream, it was that it mirrored the truth of how I felt in waking life, unloved, unwanted, and utterly alone. Rejection in a dream, rejection in reality, it didn't matter. The pain was the same, the way it twisted in my chest like a knife. I could still see her face, that smile that wasn't meant for me, that smile that was meant to hide the fact that she'd already made up her mind. I was nothing to her. I was nothing. Lying in the dark, I tried to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be found. There never is when it comes to rejection, especially the kind that leaves no reason, no explanation. It simply leaves you hollow, a shell of the person you thought you were. In the end, I was left with nothing but the echo of her words, the ghost of her smile, and the realization that love, even in a dream, could turn on you in an instant. And just like that, she was gone.
Moonlit Lust by Thomas Miller. In the still of the night, when the world is asleep, my heart beats faster. At the thought of you, my sweet, with the moon as our witness, and the stars as our guide, I am consumed by lust, for you, my dear Morgana, by my side. Your touch ignites a fire that burns deep within my soul, as we dance in the shadows and lose ourselves in the role. Your lips, like honey, so soft and so sweet, as our bodies intertwine in a passionate heat. I crave your every breath, as your scent fills the air, and with each passing moment, I am lost in your stare. With every kiss, I am consumed by desire, as the flames of lust spread higher and higher. In the darkness of the night, our inhibitions fade away, as we give in to temptation and let our bodies play. The sound of our hearts, beating in sync, as we move in unison, in this dance of love and kink. Your skin against mine is like silk on fire, sending shivers down my spine, as our passion continues to inspire. In the streets, we roam under the moon's seductive light, as I call out your name, and you answer with delight. your hair wild and free, in the winds of the northeast breeze, as I am just a lighthouse keeper, and you, my dear, the beacon of my life, with ease. As the night continues, and the stars start to fade, our love and lust, in this moment, forever made. But as the dawn approaches, our time together must end. For now we must part, until the night calls us again. But the memories we've made, in the darkness of the night, will always be cherished and hold us tight. So here's to lust in the night, with you, my sweet Morgana, by my side, for in your arms, my heart and soul will forever reside.
A Kiss Upon the Barrel by Thomas Miller. The night has drawn its shroud of shade, and silence whispers low. In hollow breaths, the winds have played, where shadows softly grow. No moon to light this dreary eve, no star to pierce the gloom, only the heart's forlorn reprieve awaits the final doom. The iron cold, it meets my lips, as if to greet a friend, a lover's touch, where silence slips, and all things come to end. How gentle is this steel embrace, that knows no heart, no mind, yet in its dark and hollow face, a solace rare we find. Good night, dear world, in soft repose, I take my parting breath, to kiss the barrel, sweet and close, and dance the dance with death. No fear, no tear, just one last sigh, as darkness takes its claim, a whispered thought, a last goodbye, without a hint of shame. For life, in all its fleeting grace, has led me to this night, where shadows play and time, it sways, beyond the grasp of light. So let the steel sing soft and true, and cradle me to sleep, with one last kiss, I bid adieu, to the tears I cannot weep.
The Sea of Guilt by Thomas Miller. In the dark days of yore, beneath a sullen sky, a man named Thomas, with a heavy sigh, took a noose in hand, his fate to seal, and leapt from the lighthouse, his despair to feel. But whispers grew, in the village, stark. Thomas was not real, just a shadow in the dark. A tale of love, lost beneath the sea's cruel crest. For his sweet Morgana, the waves took to their chest. Night after night, the scene replayed, a ghostly reenactment in moonlight's shade. Thomas, a spectre, his heart forever bled, come, recreating the moment, his love was led to depths below, where silence reigns, and only memories of their love remains. The villagers heard on winds that wailed the cries of tragedy as the night assailed. For Thomas never rests, his soul entwined with Morgana's memory, forever confined. In the darkness, a lament, a sorrowful tale of a lover's leap where love did fail. But deeper still, a truth more profound, in the heart of the sea where lost loves are found. For Thomas and Morgana, in death, unite, beyond the reach of day and into the night. A story of love, and its tragic end, where shadows weep and spirits bend. So listen close, when the sea calls your name, for the cries of tragedy are not just in fame. They speak of love, lost beneath the wave, and the souls of the lovers it could not save. In the dark days of yore, a lesson so real, love's greatest depths the sea will steal. And Thomas, a phantom, in eternal quest, to be with his Morgana, in final rest. Echoes of a Lost Chord by Thomas Miller. In the flourishing year of 1904, America was a nation on the brink of greatness, its ambitions charged with the electric promise of progress. Thomas, a humble man with a gentle soul, and Harriet, his vivacious wife, were the epitome of a love story penned by the hands of fate. They lived their lives in harmony, often finishing each other's sentences, their laughter blending seamlessly with the lively ragtime tunes filling their small town's air. However, as the winds of change brought whispers of prohibition, a looming era of sin and secrecy, so too did they usher in shadows that would eventually cloud their blissful union. The couple, once inseparable, found their bond tested as the 1920s roared into life. The world around them buzzed with new ideas and bold movements, but not all change was for the better. By the early 1930s, their marriage had become a facade, masking the painful truth of Harriet's affair with Herman, the neighbour next door. The gossip that once simmered in hushed tones now roared in the streets, and Thomas, caught in a tormenting love triangle, was pushed to the brink. In a fit of rage born from a broken heart, he committed the unthinkable, ending the lives of Harriet and Herman. Convicted and condemned, Thomas was imprisoned, his spirit as confined as his body. The years in his cell passed with the slow agony of a man who had lost everything. He was a shadow, a whisper among the other inmates, known yet unknowable. His grief and guilt were his only companions until, in a final act of despair, Thomas took his own life. His last agonized scream echoed through the prison corridors, a haunting reminder of his tragic end. Unbeknownst to Thomas, he left behind a son, Herbert, who had grown up in the cold embrace of an orphanage. When Herbert learned of his father's death, he wished for nothing more than to have known the man behind the name. As a mortician, Herbert took it upon himself to prepare his father's body, a solemn task that brought him no closure, only more questions. The funeral was a silent affair, attended only by Herbert and the lifeless form of the man he could never call father. As he mourned alone, a mysterious woman entered the funeral home. Her presence was as startling as it was intriguing: bright red hair, captivating eyes, and a sorrowful beauty. She introduced herself as Jez, Herbert's mother, and revealed her own hidden past with Thomas. All night, Herbert and Jez talked, unravelling the tangled threads of their family's history. Jez apologised for her absence, explaining the complexities and fears that kept her away. As dawn broke, Herbert realised that while he could never reclaim the years lost with his father, he could build something new with his mother. In the quiet aftermath of revelation, as he sat in his office surrounded by the tools of his trade, Herbert understood that love, though often born of pain, has the power to heal and transform. His life, once shadowed by his father's sins, now held the possibility of forgiveness and new beginnings. In the echo of a lost chord, Herbert found not just answers but also the chance to change the melody of his own life.
Shadows of Election Day by Thomas Miller. In the fall of 2024, as the country hurtled toward the pivotal 2025 election, America no longer felt like a nation bound by shared principles. The whispers of discontent had turned into pockets of unrest across the country, flaring up like wildfires, one town at a time. It seemed as though everyone was on edge, waiting for something more sinister than politics. There was no doubt, things were getting hot. Conversations that once teetered between debate and decency now turned dangerous, as states, once symbols of unity, started pitting against one another. Neighbors glanced suspiciously over fences. Streets where children used to play now felt like lines drawn in sand, dividing people who had once celebrated 4th of July barbecues together. And as Election Day drew near, even the simple act of voting became perilous. Gone were the friendly lines outside of polling stations. This year, voters stood in line not only with ballots but with a looming sense of dread. Stories spread of snipers hidden on rooftops, of masked figures targeting people at the polls, anyone who dared exercise the rights this country was built on. Few knew where the attacks originated, but whispers on social media hinted at a dark, shadowy group calling themselves the New Order. The New Order had emerged quietly, their ideas spreading in hushed conversations, hidden forums, and late-night broadcasts. They preached that America was long overdue for change, a radical upheaval of its democratic foundations. To them, the year 2025 marked a new era, and they would stop at nothing to see it realized. The people, however, were blind, led by the glint of paid news media that spun tales of false tranquility and shallow promises. Anchors on every channel repeated the same soothing messages, subtly programming people to accept a reality that was falling apart. In homes across the nation, the division was deep. Fathers turned against sons, daughters eyed mothers with suspicion. Dinner tables became battlefields, family members pitting ideals against each other with words that cut as deep as daggers. On one side, some believed in the need for radical change at any cost. On the other, there were those who clung to the rule of law, unwilling to surrender the order they held dear. As Election Day loomed closer, Death tolls from these inner conflicts rose. In communities and families alike, the violence escalated. Friends betrayed friends, mothers and fathers turned away from their children, and siblings were divided in deadly opposition. Some took to torturing those who opposed the new order's ideals, and others resorted to retaliation, desperate to restore balance in whatever way they could. The air was thick with fear, but the new order thrived on it. Chaos and confusion were their weapons, and in the weeks before the election, they wielded them mercilessly. Election day arrived in an America that was more divided than united. This was not the country people had known. The streets were lined not with banners and patriotic chants but with the silent, eerie presence of hidden forces, shadows lurking behind the corner of every polling station. Voters moved with caution, their heads down, eyes scanning the rooftops, fearing the crack of a distant shot more than they ever had in wartime. This was the new order's America, an America on the edge. And as people made their way to cast their votes, the hope of true change flickered dimly, like a candle on the verge of burning out. 2025, indeed, would bring change, but not the kind anyone expected. The day had finally arrived. The cold, grey dawn of election day cast a muted light over the town, and in every corner, people seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the storm they knew was coming. America had changed, and as the day unfolded, lives would be forever altered by choices made in a few precious hours. Ethan Caldwell, a father's resolve. Ethan Caldwell stood in line outside the polling station, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket, fingers curling around the pocket knife his father had once given him. The faint chill of the metal was a comfort, a reminder of simpler days, when casting a vote felt like an act of pride, not defiance. Around him, people shuffled nervously, casting wary glances toward the rooftops. Rumors of snipers had spread, and the figure of a young man with binoculars stationed nearby did nothing to calm the crowd's nerves. Yet Ethan stayed, steady in his resolve. His son, Max, had already succumbed to the new order's toxic rhetoric. The least he could do was stand his ground, vote for a future that Max might one day come to understand. But as he waited, he noticed a group of young protesters gathering across the street. They wore the familiar bandanas and armbands of the new order, their eyes sharp, filled with purpose. And among them, to Ethan's dismay, was Max. Their eyes locked across the street, and Ethan felt a pang of something that was more than anger, it was grief. He raised a hand, hoping for a moment of connection, a silent plea to his son. But Max turned away, chanting slogans with the others, a stranger in the crowd. Ethan's jaw tightened. Today, he thought, he would vote not just for himself, but for the future he once hoped Max would believe in. Max Caldwell, the moment of decision. For Max, the morning felt electric. The protesters were his tribe now, people who understood that a revolution wasn't born out of politeness but out of rage. He held a hand-lettered sign reading, "Change by any means." As he stood on the sidewalk, he could feel the adrenaline thrumming through him, the anticipation of change. But then, as he looked across the street, he saw his father standing in line, a solid figure against the backdrop of nervously shifting voters. The sight of him there, surrounded by what Max saw as symbols of the broken past, unsettled him. Max wanted to look away, to stay focused, but something about his father's steady gaze wouldn't let him. Suddenly, a voice crackled over his friend's radio, a signal from one of the new order's enforcers positioned near the polls. The line's growing. Might be time for a little disruption, the voice sneered, sending a shiver of excitement through Max's friends. They cheered, but Max's hands tightened on his sign. Disruption. It was a word he'd heard too often lately, a sanitized way of describing the chaos, the pain. Without thinking, Max stepped back, muttering an excuse to his friends. He crossed the street, weaving his way toward his father, his sign hidden by his side. He didn't know what he was doing, he only knew that he needed to understand why his father stood there, unwavering, in the face of the violence Max had chosen to embrace. Lily Ortega, a crisis of conscience. Across town, Lily Ortega sat in her car, the hum of her phone vibrating with messages from editors and contacts in the new order. Election day coverage was in full swing, and she was supposed to be live streaming updates on the people's resistance. Her words were their words, after all. But as she scrolled through her feed, her hand hesitated. The images on her screen were disturbing, polling sites splattered with blood, terrified faces, ambulances parked outside hospitals. Her inbox was flooded with messages, desperate calls for help, questions about why the media was covering up the real story, why they were promoting violence instead of peace. Every headline, every word she had written now felt like a betrayal. Her stomach churned. She'd thought the new order was the answer, a way to shake the people awake, to reveal the country's hidden flaws. But now, watching the chaos unfold, she wondered if she had unleashed a monster. Heart-pounding, she made a decision: she would expose the truth, no matter the cost. Grabbing her phone, she started recording, her face tense as she began to speak. "The truth is, this violence is orchestrated," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "People are dying for a cause that doesn't care about them. We've been lied to. I've been part of it. And it stops now." Her words felt like a dam breaking, and in that moment, Lily knew she was now an enemy of the new order. She sent the live stream into the ether, knowing that once it was out, there was no going back. Karen Weiss, a mother's fear and strength. Karen huddled in the corner of her small living room, holding her two daughters close. Outside, the sounds of distant protests and occasional gunfire echoed through the streets. Her sister, Tara, had tried to convince her to join a New Order demonstration, even banging on her door that morning, accusing her of betraying the cause when she refused. Karen's hands shook as she held her phone, waiting for updates, praying that the violence would subside, that somehow this day would end peacefully. But she knew, deep down, that things were only beginning. Her mind raced as she thought about what might happen if her sister came back with her New Order friends. Her daughter's frightened eyes anchored her, and in that moment, Karen felt a surge of protectiveness that overrode her fear. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you," she whispered to her daughters, forcing strength into her voice. She dialed Ethan's number. He had always been a voice of calm and reason, a friend who had once promised to help her if she ever needed it. As the line connected, she heard his voice, a steady anchor in the storm. "Ethan. I'm scared. The girls are scared. I don't know what to do." "I'll be there," Ethan said without hesitation, his voice steady and sure. "Stay inside. I'm coming." David Kim, The Enforcer's Dilemma. David Kim perched on the rooftop, scanning the crowds through his scope. His orders were clear: ensure that anyone in the line who posed a threat to the New Order's interests would be removed. It was a cold directive, but one he had been trained to carry out. Loyalty to the cause meant loyalty to the Order. But as he watched the people below, he felt an unusual pang, a strange sense of unease. He saw an older man, standing firm in line, meeting the gaze of a young man with a sign. He recognized the flicker of recognition between them, and for a moment, David's finger faltered on the trigger. Memories surfaced unbidden, memories of his own father, who had never understood David's choice to join the New Order. The same conversations, the same distance had separated them until his father's death. Now, watching these two men in a silent standoff, David couldn't bring himself to act. A message crackled in his earpiece: "You've got a target. Take him out. Don't hesitate." David's breath caught. He gritted his teeth, refusing to pull the trigger, and removed his finger from the weapon entirely. The orders were one thing, carrying them out here, now, was another. Instead, he threw down his scope, packed up, and left his position. As he walked away from the rooftop, he knew he would have to face the New Order's consequences, but for now, he felt strangely free. The collision. As Ethan reached Karen's house, he was met by Max, who had followed him there, desperate to talk. Father and son stood on the lawn, eyes locked in a standoff filled with words unspoken. But before they could speak, Tara appeared, her face twisted with fury as she approached with two New Order members. Karen emerged from her house, her daughters clinging to her legs. The family confrontation was interrupted by Lily's broadcast blaring from someone's phone, a shocking admission, denouncing the very cause Max and Tara had dedicated themselves to. Chaos erupted. Tara lunged, shouting about betrayal, while Max tried to pull her back. In the struggle, Max yelled, "This isn't what we wanted, Tara. This isn't what it's supposed to be." David, arriving at the scene, now unarmed, saw the family torn apart, facing the impact of the New Order's promises. He hesitated, watching Ethan shield his family from the wrath of his own son's beliefs. Something in the sight broke the last of his allegiance to the New Order. In a rare moment of unity, Ethan, Max, Karen, and even David faced off against Tara and her accomplices. The fighting was brief and ended in stunned silence, each of them left contemplating the cost of a broken America, the price they'd all paid for different versions of loyalty. In the days that followed, the Caldwell family, Karen, and David found themselves as unlikely allies, bound by a fragile, tentative trust. They would need each other to survive the future they'd unknowingly built, a future shaped by the choices of Election Day, by the people they had lost, and by the truth they had finally dared to confront.
Hey, this is author Thomas Miller. You have reached my YouTube channel. This is a audio book recording of all my stories in a audio form. If you would like to read some of my other stories, go to authorthomasmiller.com, where you can read all my stories free of charge. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful day.
Story formed the heart of Thomas Miller. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind of night that leaves you feeling lonely and lost. The kind of night that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world. For Thomas Miller, it was a night filled with overwhelming sadness and a deep sense of hopelessness. He sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at the wall, tears streaming down his face. Thomas had been struggling for years, battling with depression and anxiety. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of darkness, unable to find a way out. He had sought help, tried therapy and medication, but nothing seemed to ease the pain and despair he felt every day. He felt like he was trapped in a never-ending cycle of despair, and he couldn't see a way out. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, a familiar voice whispered in his ear. It was the voice of his friend John, who had taken his own life just a few months ago. John had been struggling with his own demons, and in a moment of desperation, he had ended his life. Thomas couldn't help but wonder if John had found the peace and relief he was searching for in death. The thought of suicide had crossed Thomas's mind many times before, but he'd always pushed it away, too scared of the consequences. But on this dark and lonely night, with the memory of his friend's voice haunting him, Thomas couldn't help but entertain the idea. He began to think that maybe suicide was the only way out of his pain and suffering. But then, in a moment of clarity, Thomas remembered the teachings of his faith. He was a devout Christian, and he knew that suicide was considered a sin. But as he thought about it more, he began to question the teachings of his church. How could a loving God condemn someone for wanting to end their suffering? Wasn't it better to end their pain and be with God in heaven? Thomas opened his Bible and began to read. He came across a passage that seemed to speak directly to him. It said, "For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord." Romans 8:39. In that moment, Thomas realized that suicide was not a sin in the eyes of God. His faith was strong, and he believed that the Lord would not judge him for wanting to end his pain. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. But Thomas knew that he couldn't just end his life without a plan. He wanted to make sure that he would be with his friend John in heaven. He began to research different ways to end his life, looking for the quickest and most painless method. As he delved deeper into his research, he stumbled upon a website that spoke about the concept of assisted suicide. The website explained that in some countries, there were laws in place that allowed terminally ill individuals to end their lives with the help of a doctor or medical professional. The more Thomas read, the more he felt that this was the answer he had been searching for. He was terminally ill, and his pain and suffering would only increase as his illness progressed. He didn't want to die alone and in pain. He wanted to die with dignity and be reunited with his friend John in heaven. With newfound determination, Thomas began to make the necessary arrangements for assisted suicide. He found a doctor who was willing to help him, and he said his goodbyes to his loved ones. He was at peace with his decision, knowing that he would soon be reunited with his friend and free from the pain and suffering of this world. On the day of his assisted suicide, Thomas was surrounded by his family and friends. They were all there to say their final goodbyes and to support him in his decision. As the doctor administered the medication that would end his life, Thomas felt a sense of calm and serenity wash over him. He was ready to be with his friend and his Lord. As he took his last breaths, Thomas closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. Lord, I know that you do not judge me for this decision. I am ready to be with you and John in heaven. Thank you for giving me the strength to make this choice. And with that, Thomas peacefully passed away, surrounded by love and knowing that he would be reunited with his loved ones in the afterlife. In the days following Thomas's death, his family and friends were left to grieve and question his decision. Some criticized him for taking his own life, while others understood and supported his choice. But for Thomas, there was no doubt in his mind that he had made the right decision. As he walked through the gates of heaven, Thomas was greeted by his friend John, who was waiting for him with a smile on his face. They embraced and walked hand in hand, surrounded by the beauty and love of heaven. And as they looked down upon the world they had left behind, they knew that they had made the right choice. In this fallen world, suicide was not a sin, but a way to be reunited with their Lord and loved ones. They were at peace, knowing that they were with their King, forever free from pain and suffering.
How a Janitor Saved My Life by Thomas Miller. There I was, in the dimly lit hallways of a hospital that never slept, feeling as though life had knocked me down for good. It was a place meant for healing, but for me, it felt more like a prison. I was a writer, or at least, I used to be. In my early years of both writing and coming to terms with the debilitating illness that now consumed my thoughts, I found myself not in a psychiatric ward, but in a place where few around me had their minds in one piece. My admission was the result of a traumatic brain injury episode, and the line between reality and chaos often blurred for me. I had paid thousands of dollars for specialists to help me, to guide me through this maze of confusion and pain. Psychiatrists, neurologists, and therapists, all armed with fancy degrees and expensive solutions. But, despite all their efforts, I still felt lost, drowning in a sea of anxiety, fear, and a debilitating sense that nothing would ever make sense again. I was at the edge of hopelessness, convinced that there was no one who could pull me out of this darkness. That's when I met him. The janitor. I don't even remember his name, and in some ways, it doesn't matter. He wasn't there to give me some elaborate medical advice or prescribe me another medication. No, he was there for something much more simple, and infinitely more powerful. It began with small, unexpected acts of kindness. I would often see him pushing his cart down the hallways, quietly whistling to himself as if nothing in the world could weigh him down. His demeanor was calm, almost peaceful, which stood in stark contrast to the chaos within my mind. One night, as I sat slumped in a chair near the nurse's station, completely overwhelmed by my thoughts, he stopped by. With a gentle smile, he asked, "How are you holding up, kid?" I gave him a half-hearted shrug. What could I say? That I was a writer who could barely write anymore? That I felt like I had lost everything, including myself? He seemed to understand my silence. "You know," he said, "I've been working here for years, and I've seen people come and go. Some make it out better than they came in, and some, well, they don't. But it's never the doctors who make the difference. It's always something deeper." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued by his words. This was a man who swept floors, mopped spills, and changed garbage bags, and yet here he was, talking like someone who had seen the world's deepest truths. "It's not what life throws at you," he continued, "it's what you take from it. Reality ain't easy to cope with, never has been, never will be. But it's the simple things that'll save you, the people who show up when you least expect it, the moments that remind you that you're still here, still breathing." I didn't say much in return that night, but his words stayed with me. They gnawed at the edges of my despair, slowly unraveling the tight knots of fear and doubt. Over the next few days, I found myself seeking him out, not intentionally at first, but almost by accident. Each time we spoke, he offered another nugget of wisdom, often wrapped in a story from his own life. He told me how he had struggled once, long ago, when the world seemed like it was crumbling around him. He never said what had happened, but I could hear the weight in his voice. "You gotta find the small victories," he said one day as he wiped down a nearby window. "Maybe today you just get out of bed, maybe tomorrow you write a sentence. But it's those little things that add up. You keep on going because you've got no choice, and one day, you realize you're stronger than you ever gave yourself credit for." It hit me then, this man, this janitor, was giving me something that no doctor or specialist had been able to. He was giving me perspective. He was teaching me that coping with reality wasn't about having all the answers or fixing everything at once. It was about surviving one moment at a time, about finding hope in the smallest, most overlooked places. He reminded me that life is full of teachers, and they don't always come in the form of those who wear white coats or charge hefty fees for their time. Sometimes, they come in the form of someone who cleans the floors beneath our feet, someone who sees life for what it truly is because they've had to fight their own battles in the quiet corners of the world. As the days passed, I found strength in his words. Slowly, I started writing again. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And that something was more than I had had in months. Each word felt like a small victory, a step toward reclaiming the person I thought I had lost. By the time I was discharged from the hospital, I was a different person. Not because of the countless therapy sessions or the expensive treatments, but because of a janitor who took the time to see me, to really see me. He taught me that life isn't about perfection or even understanding everything that happens to us. It's about endurance, about surviving the moments when we think we can't, and finding light where we least expect it. So, here's what I want everyone to remember: it's not always about who gives you the lessons in life. It's about the lessons themselves, the simple truths we gather along the way that help us carry on. Because sometimes, the person who saves you isn't the one you expect. And that, my friends, is the power of life.
Chapter 1: The Old Mill. In the heart of Wiltshire, nestled between undulating hills and meandering streams, stood an ancient mill. The building had withstood the tempests of time for centuries, its red brick walls weathered but sturdy. Ivy crept along the sides, and the slow turning of the mill wheel echoed the gentle rhythm of the brook that had long nourished the surrounding countryside. The mill, operated by old Samuel Thorncroft, was not just a building, it was an emblem of the quiet persistence of rural life. Samuel was the last in a long line of millers, inheriting the craft from his father, who had taken it from his grandfather, and so on, until the origins were lost in memory. Despite its age, the mill continued to produce the finest flour in the county, sought by villagers and gentry alike. On any given morning, the scent of freshly ground wheat filled the air, blending with the earthy aroma of damp moss and wildflowers that grew along the banks of the brook. Samuel Thorncroft, though in his 70s, moved with a deliberate grace that belied his age. His hands, worn and calloused from decades of labor, still retained their strength. Yet, it was his eyes that drew the attention of anyone who ventured to the mill. They were not the bright eyes of youth, nor were they entirely dulled by age. Instead, they held a certain melancholy, a weight of the years, of stories untold and memories that lingered just beneath the surface. Samuel had outlived his wife, Margaret, who had passed away some 10 years earlier. The loss had etched deep lines into his face, though he rarely spoke of her. Their only son, Jonathan, had left the village at an early age, lured by the promises of the distant city. Samuel had received letters from him in the early years, but those had long since ceased, leaving only the vague hope that his boy might one day return. The villagers often whispered about the old miller's solitude. Some said that the mill itself was haunted by the spirit of Margaret, who could be seen wandering along the brook at twilight, her pale figure just visible among the reeds. Others believed that Samuel had grown cold and distant, hardened by grief and the slow passage of time. But Samuel Thorncroft was not a man given to sentiment. He rose each morning before the sun, performed his duties at the mill with a quiet diligence, and retired to his small cottage in the evenings, where a single candle flickered in the window, casting a faint glow into the gathering dusk. It was on such an evening that the story begins, a mild autumn night, when the last traces of sunlight were fading from the sky, and the air carried the first hint of winter. Samuel sat by the fire, his pipe in hand, staring into the flames. The crackling of the wood and the soft hum of the mill's machinery in the distance were the only sounds that broke the stillness. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Samuel rose slowly, his joints stiff from years of labor. He opened the door to find a young woman standing on the threshold. She was dressed in a plain but neat gown, her bonnet askew as if she had been walking a great distance. "Evenin', sir," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry to trouble you, but I'm in need of some help." Samuel studied her for a moment, noting the weariness in her eyes and the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, as though unsure of her welcome. "What kind of help?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. The young woman hesitated, then spoke. "I've nowhere to stay for the night, and the innkeeper said the rooms were full. I was hoping you might have some corner where I could rest." Samuel considered her request. It was not uncommon for travelers to seek refuge at the mill, especially in the colder months, but there was something about this woman that stirred a faint memory in the back of his mind, something familiar, though he could not place it. "You can stay in the barn," he said at last. "It's warm enough, and there's straw for bedding." The woman nodded gratefully. "Thank you, sir." Samuel led her to the barn, where the sweet scent of hay filled the air. She thanked him again before settling down on a makeshift bed of straw. As he closed the door behind him, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that he had seen her before. But where? Chapter 2, The Return of Shadows. The next morning, the mill was alive with the usual activity. The wheel turned slowly, creaking in rhythm with the brook. Samuel, as was his custom, had risen early and gone about his work, but his thoughts kept returning to the young woman in the barn. When he brought her a plate of bread and cheese for breakfast, she was already awake, sitting by the open door and gazing out at the fields, where a soft mist clung to the grass. "You've been kind, sir," she said, accepting the food with a smile. "More than I deserve." Samuel waved off the compliment. "It's nothing. You'll be on your way soon, I expect?" The woman nodded, though her expression grew distant. I'll be leavin'. But there's something I must ask you, if you don't mind." Samuel raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "Did you know a man by the name of Jonathan Thorncroft?" she asked quietly. At the mention of his son's name, Samuel felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had not spoken of Jonathan in years, not even to those closest to him. "I did," he replied, his voice barely more than a whisper. "He was my son." The woman's eyes widened in surprise. "Your son?" Samuel nodded, his throat tightening. "He left this place many years ago. I haven't heard from him since." For a moment, there was only the sound of the mill wheel turning and the soft gurgling of the brook. Then the young woman spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "Jonathan Thorncroft was my father." Chapter 3, The Weight of Years. The revelation struck Samuel like a blow, though he did not let it show. His son, his long-lost son, had a daughter. And she stood before him now, a grown woman, with the same eyes and gentle features that he had once seen in Jonathan's mother. Samuel's hands trembled as he set the plate of food down beside her. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "He never told me." The young woman, who introduced herself as Eliza, explained that her father had spoken little of his past. He had moved to the city, where he had found work as a clerk in a factory. He had married and started a family, but the hardships of life had taken their toll. Jonathan had passed away when Eliza was still a child, leaving her and her mother to fend for themselves. Eliza had come to the village in search of her roots, hoping to find some connection to the father she had never truly known. She had not expected to find her grandfather still living, let alone running the same mill that her father had once spoken of in his letters. For Samuel, the discovery of his granddaughter was bittersweet. It stirred memories that he had long buried, memories of a time when the mill had been filled with the laughter of children, and the future had seemed bright and full of promise. But those days were gone, and the weight of the years pressed heavily upon him. Chapter 4, New Beginnings. In the weeks that followed, Eliza stayed on at the mill, helping Samuel with his work and learning the ways of the trade. She was a quick learner, and her presence brought a new energy to the old mill, as if the spirit of her father had returned to the place where he had been born. For Samuel, it was a